What did Greek sound like 2,000 years ago here in Rome? After Latin, Greek was the most spoken language in the city and all throughout the Roman Empire. Did it sound like classical Greek? Did it sound like modern Greek? Well, in this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about Lucian pronunciation, named after 2nd century Greek author Lucian of Samosata, whose written word united classical Greek with the literature of all antiquity. This pronunciation system represents the sound of Greek at the height of its cultural and literary influence. Lucian pronunciation can make ancient Greek easier to learn and to teach, and can help us appreciate the literature more fully. Join me as we explore the voices that changed through the centuries. I'm Luke, and this is Plymothy. Here on the screen is the table of contents with timestamps for all the things I'm going to be covering in this video. The first thing is going to be a simple explanation of all 6 variants of Lucian pronunciation. And thus this video will be a complete update to the original video about Lucian pronunciation from 2020. Then later, I'm going to go into depth about the historical evidence for each one of these pronunciation variants, the linguistic theory that helps us understand them, and the pedagogical applications of each one. So what is Lucian pronunciation? Lucian pronunciation is a system of conventions for speaking and reciting ancient Greek as it sounded during the Koine period. That's Koine for you modern Greek speakers. Στα αγγλικά λέμε Koine γιατί δανειστήκαμε αυτή τη λέξη απευθείας από τα αρχαία ελληνικά, όχι από τα νέα ελληνικά. Στην κλασική αττική διάλεκτο αυτή η λέξη προφέρεται Koine και αυτή είναι η βάση για την προφορά της λέξης στα αγγλικά, σε αντίθεση με την προφορά της λέξης στα νέα ελληνικά, που φυσικά είναι Koine. Τα αρχαία ελληνικά προφέρονταν πολύ διαφορετικά από τα νέα ελληνικά και σε αυτό το βίντεο θα διερευνήσουμε πώς και πότε συνέβησαν αυτές οι αλλαγές. Ancient Greek went through a lot of changes in the Koine period, which goes from the 4th century BC to the 6th century AD. The variants of Lucian pronunciation are nicknamed after cities evocative of places and times where important evolutions in the phonology can be observed or inferred. These 6 variants are Romaic, Pompeian, Alexandrine, Memphite, Samosatene, and Antiochene. Romaic Lucian is the most conservative variant, meaning that it's the closest to classical Attic pronunciation of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, which will be described in detail later on. Indeed, Romaic Lucian is the restored pronunciation of Attic in the 1st century BC, the pronunciation used by educated Romans, hence the name, and also the standard pronunciation of Greek in the wider Mediterranean and Roman world of the early to mid-Koine period. Its notable features include aspirates for letters chi, theta, phi, ka, ta, pa, just like classical Attic. For example, karte, ke kareka, theos, ditemi, pilosopos, pepileka. The diphthongs are all intact. Autos, euge, aidia, oikos. In this convention, alpha iota and omicron iota have been made identical to the diphthongs of classical Latin ae, oe, I, oi. The other vowels are also just like in Latin, including only length contrast for these pairs. Ethos, ethos, legomen, legomen. You probably know from having watched other videos of mine that classical Latin most likely had the same quality for long and short vowels, and that their only fundamental difference was one of duration. This also seems to be true of the attested pronunciation of Greek in the time of classical Latin, and thus is a key part of the Romaic variant. Omicron hypsilon is just a digraph, of course, not a true diphthong in the modern linguistic sense, and is pronounced u. This is true for all variants of Lucian pronunciation. Xoutos. Epsilon iota is another such digraph, and is pronounced identically to the long iota, e before consonants, and e before vowels. Heraklitos, Deiopeia. Along with Omicron hypsilon as u, all variants of Lucian pronunciation have in common a few other features that distinguish them from classical Attic pronunciation. The long diphthongs, which in classical Attic are pronounced ai, ei, oi, are always monophthongs, having merged with long alpha, eta, and omega, a, e, o. Idia, lege, rhapsodos. The voiceless r, is also retained in Romaic as well as most of the variants, initially and geminated, arsen. The letter zeta is a geminated z for all variants, dozen. And the most important common feature across the variants of Lucian pronunciation is the retention of phonemic vowel length, as well as pitch accent. And a bit later, I'll train you how to do both. In order to get a sense of the sound of Romaic Lucian pronunciation, let's use it to recite the introduction of Lucian of Samosate's A True Story in the Romaic variant. Os pertois athletikois kai peritenton somaton epimelean ascolumenois, ute seoexias monon, udeton gymnasion prontis estin, alekaites katakairon nomenes aneseos, meros guntes askeseos, domegiston auten hypulambanusin, uto de kaito spiritus logus espudacosin hegumai prosekin metaten polenton spudaioteron anagnosin, anienai teten dianoian, kai proston epi takamaton akmaioteran paraskeoazin. Bye-bye. That final bye-bye isn't in the original. I just added it because it has a sound that will change in some of the variants when we hear the same text again later. Also, something you might notice about how I do pitch accent in Lucian pronunciation is that I support it with stress accent, that is, with increased volume, with increased loudness. That's what stress accent is. And I do that for some reasons that we'll discuss later. In any case, here is the English translation of the text. Those interested in athletics and in the care of their bodies are concerned not only with good habits and exercise, but also with relaxation in the off-season. In fact, they consider this the most important part of their training. Similarly, I feel that students, after much reading of serious works, may profitably relax their minds to prepare them to be yet more vigorous for future labor. Wow. Pompeian Lucian is almost identical to Romaic Lucian, with two important differences. Chi, theta, and phi are all fricatives, just like in modern Greek. Ch, tha, pha. Charte, theos, philosophos. And epsilon iota is e in all positions, as it will be as well in all the remaining variants. Energia. The support for this phonological system is derived partly from inscriptional evidence found in Pompeii, which I'll tell you about in more detail later. Here's the same introduction to Lucian's A True Story in the Pompeian variant of Lucian pronunciation. Os pertois athletikois kai peritenton somaton epimelian ascholumenois, ute seoexias monon, udeton gymnasion frontis estin, allekaites katakairon nomenes aneseos, meros guntes askeseos domegiston auten hypulambanusin, uto de kaito spiritus logus spudacosin hegumai prosekin metaten polenton spudaioteron anagnosin, anienai detendianoian, kai proston epi takamaton akmaioteran paraskeoazin. Bye-bye. Alexandrine Lucian retains the aspirates katapa for chi, theta, phi, while gamma, delta, beta are fricatives, ra, tha, va, as in modern Greek. Theogonos, diapero, vatrakos. Also as in modern Greek, we have the palatalization of velars before front vowels, thus kata, koria, raia, but genos, kir, genesis. The Alexandrine variant has pseudo-diphthongs that end up sounding rather similar to Attic diphthongs. Au, eu, ai, oi. Aurion, eugenes, athenaios, homoios. Eta and omega are close in quality, e, u, while epsilon and omicron are open, e, o. These features, among others, are based on the evidence from Egypt. Here again, a true story in Alexandrine Lucian. Os pertois athletikois kai peritenton somaton epimelian ascolumenuis, utes euexias monon, udeton gymnasion prontis estin, allekaites katakairon nomenes aneseos, meros guntes askeseos domegiston auten hypulambanusin. Uto de kaito spiritus logus espudacosin heumai prosekin metaten polenton spudaioteron anagnosin anienai teten dianoian, kai proston epi takamaton akmaioteran paraskeoazin. Vavai. Memphite Lucian pronunciation is also derived from the evidence for Common Greek recorded in Egypt and is quite similar to Alexandrine, but is somewhat more innovative. The classical diphthongs alpha iota and omicron iota are monophthongs, a, dia, kos. Alpha hypsilon and epsilon hypsilon are av, af, ev, f, avros, aftos, evarkia, evtropos. This variant also treats the rough breathing as silent, utos. Initial and geminated R is now voiced, as normally in Spanish and Italian. Rhapsodos, arren. Now let's hear that Lucian text in Memphite Lucian. Ospertus athleticus cae periten ton somaton epimelian ascolumenus, ute sevexias monon, ute ton gymnasion prontis estin, allacertes cataceron genomenes aneseos, meros guntes ascesios tomeiston afte nupulambanusin. Uto de cetus peritus logus espudacosin, egume prosecin metaten pollen ton spudeuteron anagnosin, anienda teten dianuan, cepros ton epitagamaton acmeoteran parascevasin. Vave? Since a number of innovations in Greek phonology are tested earlier in Syria and Anatolia, the last two variants take their names from this region. Samosatene Lucian pronunciation is the somewhat central variant that Raphael Torregiano and I espoused in the original Lucian pronunciation video from 2020, and shows a number of transitional features. The diphthongs alpha iota and omicron iota are in their last stage before monophthongization. Ai, ui, aetia, uikos. The other diphthongs, alpha hypsilon and epsilon hypsilon, are pseudo-diphthongs, ending in a rounded bilabial fricative. Auv, auf, euv, euf, aurion, auftos, euvye, euphoros. Samosatene Lucian has 6 fricatives, nearly the same as modern Greek, with the exception of phi and beta, which are bilabial fricatives, pha, v, theogonos, diaphero, vatrachos. As in the Egyptian variants, velars are palatalized before front vowels. Genos, hir, genesis, angelos. Here again is a true story, and now in Samosatene Lucian. Hospertus athleticus cae peritenton somaton epimelian ascolumenus, ute seuvexias monon, ude ton gymnasion frontis estin, allacetes cataceron genomenes aneseos, meros guntes ascesios tomeiston auften hypulambanusin, huto decetus peritus logus espudacosin hegumae prosecin metaten pollenton spudeuteron anagnosin, aniennae deten dianuian, cepros ton epita camaton acmeioteran parasceuvasin. Vavae? Finally, Antiochene Lucian pronunciation is the more innovative version of what we saw in Samosatene, and the most innovative of all the variants. The diphthongs have completed the process of monophthongization and are virtually identical to their modern Greek equivalents. U, av, af, ev, ef, tia, ukos, avrion, aftos, evexia, ephporos. The rough breathing is silent, and the voiceless R is voiced normally. Rhapsodia, oarrin. Phi and beta are labiodental fricatives as in modern Greek, pha, va, philosophos, varvaros. The quality of epsilon and the former diphthong alpha iota have merged to and respectively, while the letter eta now represents the long closed vowel e. Philae, ethos, ethos. And now let's hear what the intro to a true story sounds like in Antiochene Lucian. Ospertus athleticus ceperitenton somaton epimelian ascolumenus, ute sevexias monon, ude ton gymnasion frontis estin, allacertes cataceron genomenes aneseos, meros guntes ascesios tomeiston aften hypulambanusin, uto decetus peritus logus espudacosin, egume prosecin metaten pollenton spudeuteron anagnosin, aniene deten dianuian, cepros ton epita camaton acmeioteran parascevasin. Vave? The Antiochene variant has virtually the same qualities in vowels and consonants as found in Buthian pronunciation. The most important characteristic of all the variants, and the thing that unites them as Lucian pronunciation, is that they all prescribe phonemic vowel length and pitch accent. Now, these two characteristics are actually the most important part of ancient Greek, not just pronunciation, not just the phonology, but the grammar, the morphology, the literature, and not just for the poetry. And in a moment, I'm going to give you a crash course on how to do phonemic vowel length and pitch accent in ancient Greek. But if you want to learn everything you need to know about ancient Greek's grammar, vocabulary, and idiom, then you should sign up for classes at Ancient Language Institute, this video's sponsor. ALI's Ancient Greek course gives you the foundation you need to understand Biblical Greek of the Koine Bible, or read the classical Attic philosophers, or discuss the Homeric epics. That's because ALI's goal is to make you a fluent reader, not just a translator. And it does this by using the direct method. Language acquisition studies have shown that we learn languages, native or foreign, modern or ancient, through input.
Need input.
Input. All right, you got it. Okay.
Listening and reading. So ALI gives its students tons of audio and visual material to introduce you to the language before you even show up in the Zoom classroom. And before you know it, you'll be a fluent reader of ancient Greek.
Input. More input.
Okay, no problem.
And not just ancient Greek. ALI offers Latin, Biblical Hebrew, and Old English too. Registration for the spring semester closes December 16th with new cohorts starting in Latin, Ancient Greek, Hebrew, and Old English, with intermediate and advanced classes too in all 4 languages. Sign up today at ancientlanguage.com. So how do we do phonemic vowel length? Let's take some examples and use Pompeian Lucian pronunciation to demonstrate. Athla, agan, legetai, legetai, imi, imi, legomai, legomai, lusamen, leluca, elelukin. In Pompeian Lucian pronunciation, each of the long and short vowel pairs here has the same quality, so that's not what's distinguishing them. The difference is merely one of length. So in athla and agan, we have the longer vowels, the first part of the athla and the second part of the agan. Those are the long vowels. But notice that even if a vowel has an accent, like in agan, we don't hold it for longer. We do have that tendency in English and Italian and some other languages. We want to lengthen the stressed vowel. But here, the accented vowel agan is short. So don't say agan, that would be incorrect, or agan. The same is also true for the legetai, legetai pairs. So here we have the unstressed long vowel legetai, that long legetai. A lot of people want to say legetai, but that's wrong. That would be lengthening that initial vowel. So don't do that. With the next pair, imi, imi. Notice that where the accent is on the final mi, that's just a short mi, but the unaccented syllable that comes before it is still long. It's a long vowel, imi. Same thing again with legomai. In fact, people might want to say legomai. Well, that's wrong because this is a short vowel. Legomai. It needs to be short in duration. Whereas the omega in the second word, legomai, that is a long vowel. So that needs to have a long duration, certainly longer than the short version of that vowel in the word that's next to it. Legomai, 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 legomai. In lusamen, we have 2 long vowels that are not accented. U, e. So make sure that they are long because the accented vowel is short. Lusamen. Leluca. Make sure you don't say leluca because that's a short epsilon. Leluca. And then, of course, elelukin. There we have an accented short u, but then a long vowel that follows it. Elelukin. So make sure you don't say elelukin. That would be wrong. An exceedingly critical characteristic of ancient Greek is that closed syllables are long in duration, something ancient Greek has in common with Latin. Thus, thalata, or thalassa, if you prefer. Note that these are not thalata or thalassa, as a modern Greek speaker would pronounce them. The geminated consonants make the whole preceding syllable, lat or las respectively, long in duration. Also note that the short initial alpha is indeed short. Thalata, thalassa. Most people make the mistake of lengthening the initial alpha. Thalata, thalassa. Why would these people do this? Well, unless they know fluently a modern language that has phonemic vowel and syllable length, like Finnish, Japanese, Hungarian, among others, they won't realize how strange it is when they say thalata or thalassa. That's the way Italians often mispronounce these words. But they do this for a very understandable reason. It's because their native languages associate length with stress accent. But this is not a characteristic of ancient Greek. Take also legontai. To the untrained ear, assuming the ear is English or Italian among others, it sounds as if the gun syllable is being accented. Legontai. But listen again. Legontai. Legontai. The high pitch is on the short vowel epsilon. Legontai. The syllable that follows is closed, and thus must be held for a longer period of time. Saying legontai or legontai are both incorrect. You have to have the short, long syllable sequence here. Legontai. It's really important to learn a little bit about the phonotactic limitations of our native languages, since they do have an effect on our ancient Greek unless we try to control them. This takes us into pitch accent. Pitch accent is actually quite simple. The vowel that follows the accented vowel must be at a lower pitch. Thus, sulegontai. Note that the key feature is downstep, lowering of pitch, if only slightly after the accented vowel. This may be extreme, sulegontai, or subtle, sulegontai. In a phrase like alloi anthropoi legus in houtos, it's not necessary to jump up at every accented syllable, as some do when attempting to reconstruct pitch accent. They'll do something like alloi anthropoi legus in houtos. And indeed, this makes for rather unpleasant speech and isn't something found in living pitch accent languages. Now, this time, I'll start with just one pitch and merely lower the pitch after the accented vowel the simplest way that I can render pitch accent. Alloi anthropoi legus in houtos. That's the simplest pattern, but there are other factors that are part of the natural prosody of speech, so it can vary quite a bit. For example, alloi anthropoi legus in houtos, or alloi anthropoi legus in houtos. There are all kinds of possibilities. The basic structure of just doing the downstep, alloi anthropoi legus in houtos, that's the fundamental downstepping that's going on, but then on top of that, we bend everything else that's going on around the intonation of the sentence, around the prosody of the sentence. Alloi anthropoi legus in houtos. All kinds of variations are possible. The only rule is to lower the pitch after the accented vowel mora. And for example, if we have this, o versus o, this one can simply be flat, o. You don't have to rise. I know it looks like it's rising, o, but you can, that's fine. The rising ends up being actually something that's characteristic of the prosody of the sentence that gets interpreted as part of the accent. But the key feature is that on the mora that is accented, you have to then lower the pitch after that. O, o. But like I said, the natural prosody of this sentence will tend to bend these rules quite a bit, as I demonstrated with those few examples. So quite a lot of variety is possible in ancient Greek with reconstructed pitch accent. This is just the simplest way that I can explain it for our purposes today. Now that we've gotten the overview of the 6 variants, we can talk about the really fun stuff. All the historical changes, all the evidence, and also which one of these variants is more useful for different situations. So this is as good a time as any to tell you what my sources are, not just for reconstructed classical Attic, but for the phonological details I'm going to mention here, so you can look all this up for yourself. Now, one of the best manuals to get a handle on classical Attic pronunciation is Sidney Allen's famous Vox Graeca. Oh, look, there's also a modern Greek version for you modern Greek speakers, which builds on the work by Sturtevant in his The Pronunciation of Greek and Latin. Also very useful is Horrocks Greek, A History of the Language and Its People. Now, there's also a wonderful set of analyses of inscriptional evidence, especially from papyri. And for that, we have Gignac's work on the papyri that were found in Egypt, Threet on the grammar of the Attic inscriptions, and Theodorson, who looks at the phonology of Attic and the Hellenistic period. And one of my new favorites just came out this year, Ben Cantor's Pronunciation of New Testament Greek. And there's also Schweitzer and Leon and a whole bunch of others, but you'll be able to find all of these linked in the description. Now let's start our journey through the changes of pronunciation with classical Attic phonology. That'll be our starting point. The classical Attic literary period is when Athens flourished as democracy, from the beginning of the 5th century BC to the middle of the 4th century BC, about a century and a half. In addition to phonemic vowel length and pitch accent, which are fundamental, a key feature of classical Attic is a 3-way contrast between stops. In English, the main stops are ktp, gdb, and we only have a two-way phonemic contrast between voiceless and voiced stops, with a lot of phonetic variation possible that we'll get into later when it affects our ability to pronounce Attic. By the way, stops are also called plosives or occlusives. There are three names for the same thing. In Classical Attic, the voiceless stops are ktp. The kappa is articulated with the velum or soft palate. Thus, this is a velar voiceless stop. Tau is articulated towards the teeth, so we call it dental. And the pi is articulated with bow lips, thus it is a bilabial stop. Each of these voiceless stops has a voiced counterpart, g, d, b, gamma, delta, beta. And our ktp also have aspirated counterparts, k, t, p, for chi, theta, and phi, as we call them in English. These are aspirated voiceless stops. Something a lot of people get wrong here is they say that chi, for example, k, is the sound of k plus the sound of h. And they even sometimes write it KH in the International Phonetic Alphabet, an IPA. This is wrong. This is very wrong. It's written like this, K. Now, why does this matter? This matters because oftentimes the pronunciation of Kai is described as K followed by H, K plus H, which, if it were true, would mean two consonant sounds. And that would also cause us to then lengthen the previous syllable, since two consonants would close that previous syllable, as mentioned earlier when discussing phonemic syllable length. And that's not what this is. This is not the sequence of two consonants. It's a single consonant sound, and that's why it's written with the K and the superscript H, K. And what this means is that at the exact same time that you make the sound of a K, of a K, you are also making an aspiration sound, an H sound, at the exact same time. They're a simultaneous phonetic event, K. So our three trios of stops sound like this, and I'll use a little A vowel after each one so we can hear them clearly. Ktp, ktp, gadaba. Note that our English ears are not well attuned to this three-way contrast. No doubt you feel like the voiceless stops, ktp, sound pretty similar to gdb. Voice stops involve the vibration of the vocal cords when you utter them, while voiceless stops do not. G, g, d, d, b, b. I know this seems difficult, but you absolutely have to master this before even attempting Classical Attic, otherwise it won't work. But we'll get to those problems later. For now, here are some examples. Kairo, gai, gaias, terme, terpomai, derma, pos, bos, bos. Thanks to aspirates, we know that Classical Attic had a h sound, just as in Standard English. It didn't have the weight of a consonant, so it didn't close syllables to make them long. However, it did aspirate them. For example, apo, hu, is contracted to apu. The letter rho is always written with this aspiration mark when it's initial or geminated. But is it really aspirated? Really, the idea of aspiration is just a stand-in for the sound of the voiceless R, as opposed to the voiced trilled R of, say, Spanish or Italian. See my video on rho for a detailed analysis of this. The letter sigma is a retracted S sound, as in modern Greek, sh. Languages that don't have a sh sound tend to have an S phoneme that is phonetically more retracted, since it has more space in which it may be articulated without causing confusion. See the retracted S video for more. Attic letter zeta often comes from the sequence of delta plus sigma, as in baidzo, to play, from baid, child, plus this sigma. However, in Classical Attic, the z seems to have undergone metathesis, giving us zd, thus baizdo. There are a number of pieces of evidence for this. One of the most famous examples is taking the accusative Athenas plus de, which is a little particle meaning towards, and we get Athenas de, towards Athens. This metathesis also occurred in a few other dialects like Aeolic. And this later came to be regarded as a curious anomaly for Aeolic once the Koine pronunciation had become z for most speakers. See my Zeta video for more on this. Gamma has another interesting use besides standing for the voiced velar stop g. Before velar consonants, it represents the same sound that ends the word for king in sing in English, and the same sound that occurs before the G in angle. And it sounds just like that in the classical Attic word angelos. And we also have it in the English word anchor. And that word actually ultimately comes from the Greek ankyra. The ancient Greek and Roman grammarians called this velar nasal sound angma. And thanks to this fact, we can extrapolate that words where gamma is followed by mu, such as in elengmai, I have spoken, that the gamma here is the same velar nasal, the angma sound, elengmai, which also seems to remain true for all of Koine as well. The vowel letter eta is e in classical Attic, an open long vowel, and its counterpart is the epsilon iota digraph, which makes e. That's a long close vowel. Quite differently from Erasmian pronunciation, epsilon iota is not a diphthong. It is a close, long e sound. Ligi. See my epsilon iota video for a full analysis, as well as the eta video. On the back side of the vowel trapezoid, we find the open mid counterpart to e, o for omega. The backed rounded counterpart to e is u. Now, Omicron Hupsilon is U in Sturtevant's reconstruction of classical Attic, while Allen disagrees with Sturtevant, opining that U may already have been the universal pronunciation well before circa 350 BC, and thus Allen recommends U. He cites Theodorson's 1974 work to support his proposal for U, but Theodorson's 1978 study clarifies that the vulgar Attic subsystem, which I spoke about at length on the secondary channel in this video, already had a number of innovations not found in the conservative system, and the spelling system of classical Attic appears to be based primarily on the conservative phonology. So that little bit from Theodorson 1974 couldn't be used as evidence, I don't think. Sturtevant's argument that U is the correct Attic pronunciation of Omicron Hupsilon until about 350 BC, that's the end of the classical period by our reckoning, is compelling, especially when compared with evidence from the Boeotian dialect, where Boeotians began to spell their historical U sound with Omicron Hupsilon starting around 350 BC. Today, therefore, I will prescribe U as the pronunciation of Omicron Hupsilon, but other interpretations like Allen's are absolutely reasonable. Since epsilon iota and Omicron Hupsilon most often result from the lengthening of epsilon and Omicron, respectively, Sturtevant makes a strong case that the short vowels epsilon and Omicron are in fact short close vowels, I, U. Allen disagrees in Vox Graeca and cites the open nature of these vowels in the Koine period. But Theodorson's 1978 work seems to resolve this, as he demonstrates that short vowels epsilon and omicron were likely close through the classical period, but around 350 BC the conservative system changed these to more open vowels. By the way, Theodorson has been critiqued sometimes harshly, but these critiques are usually focused on his initial 1974 study, which Theodorson himself critiques in his final 1978 book, where he resolves the earlier questions. And that's the work I'm citing here, and most people don't even bother to look at that. That's the one that has a really valuable information. So look at that one. The diphthongs alpha hupsilon and epsilon hupsilon are au, eu. Alpha iota and omicron iota are I, oi. The diphthong hupsilon iota is as in the word for sun, huios. In Attic, this may have simplified frequently to just u, huios, although phonetically these are almost exactly the same thing. And however common this might have been, it was definitely restored in the Hellenistic period to the ui again. I think either is fine for classical Attic, though I tend to prefer ui unless I'm doing a reconstruction of vulgar Attic. Later, take a look at this video I did on vulgar Attic on Scorpio Martianus. Classical Attic also had long diphthongs, I, a, oi. They may be written this way, or more commonly, they're actually written as iota subscripts in most texts. When pronouncing classical Attic, it's essential to master the difference between the long diphthongs and the short diphthongs. I, oi, oi. Distinguishing these is something a lot of people completely fail to do when reciting in Attic. Naturally, the long eta with iota subscript is not confused with epsilon iota, or at least shouldn't be, since epsilon iota is the long monophthong e, and eta with the iota subscript is a. That is to say, the latter is a diphthong, the former is not, so no confusion there. And we could say a lot more about the details of Attic phonology, but this is a good basis for understanding the rest of what we'll be talking about in this video. So if we have a good reconstruction of classical Attic phonology, why not just use that for all of ancient Greek? Well, let's define exactly what ancient Greek is. To put this into perspective, ancient Greek literature starts with Homer in the 8th century BC and continues all the way until the 6th century AD. The literature from the late 4th century BC to the end of antiquity in the 6th century AD is called Koine in English. Again, that's Koine for you modern Greek speakers. The reason we call it Koine in English is that this is the anglicization of the ancient Greek word koine, that's the Attic pronunciation koine, and we did not borrow the word directly from modern Greek, hence we do not pronounce it as in modern Greek. Ελπίζω να είναι ξεκάθαρο στους Έλληνες φίλους μας. So the Koine period is pretty vast, 8 centuries, and includes the spoken Greek from Egypt to Italy, from Attica to Syria. Thus, we shouldn't be surprised to observe quite a few well-attested sound changes in the language in different regions and times, which we do. Let's talk about those changes. One of the most salient changes is called spirantization, such as the transformation of the aspirates chi theta phi from ka ta pa into fricatives, cha tha fa. Let's start with the sequence for letter chi. Ka, ka, cha. Note that in order to go from the aspirate ka to the fricative cha, we have a transitional sound, ka. This is an affricate. In English, we have affricates, like ch, as in the word attach. The IPA symbol for this sound looks like it's two different sounds, a t and a sh, and these are the sounds that effectively do go into making the affricate. However, an affricate is not two separate consonant sounds, but one, ch. That is, it does not lengthen the preceding syllable. It's not attaching, it's attaching. It's just one consonant sound, ch. The little arc over the two letters indicates that they are bound together like this as a true affricate. Thus, ka, cha. For theta, we have a similar sequence. Ta, tha, tha. The affricate, tha, is again the intermediary stage before eventually becoming tha. Here's the sequence for letter phi. Pa, pha, fa, fa. Here again, we have the affricate transition, pha, and then we have the bilabial fricative, fa, which you can hear in languages like Japanese. Say the name of Mount Fuji, Fuji. And eventually this becomes the labiodental fa, as in modern Greek. I've explored the timing of these changes in detail in a previous video. And later in this video, I'll summarize when and where each of these changes may have occurred and how they are captured by the various conventions of Lucian pronunciation. Another type of spirantization is the change of gamma, delta, beta from voice stops into fricatives. G, r, th, the, b, v, va. At some point during the Koine period, the palatalization of velars, chi, kappa, gamma, before front vowels comes into play. For example, kappa epsilon goes from ge to ge. To the untrained ear, that may sound like ge, but it's not. It's just acoustically really similar. Ge, ge. Thus, gamma epsilon took this path, ge to ge, and finally, once gamma became a fricative r elsewhere, ye. Note that this sound ye, which is also heard in modern Greek, it sounds a lot like ye, like just a J sound in IPA, but that is an approximate, whereas ye is a fricative. It's the same articulation point, it's just that there is less space between the tongue and the roof of the mouth with ye, as opposed to the little bit of more space with ye. Another important change that occurs at some point during the history of Koine is the loss of the aspirate, h. And this is known as Psilosis, Psilosis. A number of non-Attic dialects, like Aeolic, were known to have this trait, and this was notable for those ancient scholars who discussed it because it was not a standard part of Attic or the Koine that evolved from Attic. Psilosis, however, did continue to become popular through the centuries, even in standard Koine, and was a complete process by the Middle Ages. The vowel mutations are some of the most astonishing of the changes between Classical Greek and Modern Greek, and many of them began or were complete in the Koine period. The following changes occurred somewhere in the Koine period. Epsilon iota, it starts as e, but then before consonants it becomes e, while before vowels, epsilon iota merged with eta, and both became e in this position. This is the true mid-vowel, so it's not closed e and it's not open but e. But by the 1st century AD, epsilon iota seems to have become universally e for nearly everyone. Eta sequence is e, Either in very, very late antiquity or in the Middle Ages, this becomes E for most speakers. During the Koine period, omega changes from O, an open vowel, to O, a true mid vowel. In some places, it became a close U. If we use Sturtevant's model for epsilon, then we start with the close E, and then we have a true mid E, and then we have an open E. Omicron, again using Sturtevantian pronunciation, starts as U in Attic, but becomes O, just a true mid vowel in Koine. And it also became an open O in some places, in some geographies. Alpha iota has this sequence: I, I, I. Then it could monophthongize into either A or E. Omicron iota had two potential paths. One path would be Oi, Ui, U, U. Another could be Oi, Oi, Ui, U, U. Alpha Upsilon went through this sequence: Au, 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 or Auf, respectively, Av, Af, Av, Af. Starting with Av, Auf, we have two options because if a voiceless consonant follows, then we would use the voiceless variant, Auf, Af, Af. And we have the same sort of sequence for Epsilon, Upsilon, Eu. And then, assuming we have some lowering in the epsilon universally, then it should be Eu. And then we have Eu, Euv, or Elf, respectively, Ev, F, Ev, If. As discussed earlier, Omicron Upsilon used to represent U. Allen argues that this change occurred during the Classical Attic period, while Sturtevant shows that it happened right at the end of the Classical period. In any case, the universal Koine pronunciation of Omicron Upsilon is U. Very early in the Koine period, we find inscriptional evidence that shows us that zeta was no longer zda, as it was in Classical Attic for a majority of speakers. Now, it's possible that the non-Attic z, which was much more common in the Greek-speaking world, just replaced the zda sound in the new Common Greek dialect in the Koine. And this is just as geminated tau was exchanged for geminated sigma through dialect replacement. Hence, thalassa, the more common form outside of Attica, replaced thalatta. If that's what occurred, then the z was simplified to z as the nearly universal Koine pronunciation early in the Hellenistic period. Or it's possible that the z in the non-Attic dialects of Greek had already become z for a lot of them, and that this is what replaced the zda at the birth of Koine. The least likely process, but still possible, is that Classical Attic zda simplified to z. At any rate, except for a couple dialects that survived into Hellenistic times, the Koine pronunciation of zeta is z. That just about covers the majority of significant sound changes recorded during the Koine period. The 6 variants of Lucian pronunciation crystallize the stages of these sound changes into the conventions we briefly touched on earlier in the video. Later we'll learn about when these changes occurred and what geographies they may have been associated with. So as interesting as all that might be, is there any utility beyond the gee whiz of all of that? Well, actually there is. This is actually extremely practical, especially when it comes to the classroom, which means we have to talk about Erasmian. Erasmian is the name for another convention, or rather group of conventions. Contrary to what many Greeks today believe, Erasmian pronunciation is not the same thing as reconstructed Classical Attic. Classical Attic pronunciation is by definition the pronunciation of the Athenians in the 5th to the 4th centuries BC, during the Classical period. Thus, as research progresses, we may continue to perfect our understanding of this phonology, and indeed discover variations in the phonetics. For example, Allen and Sturtevant both reconstruct Classical Attic in a similar way, but disagree on a few small issues, and we touched on a few of those earlier. I tend to favor the Sturtevantian Classical Attic model, but the Elenian one is a perfectly reasonable one too, and it's even possible that both coexisted. Erasmian is something else entirely. Now, it takes its name from Erasmus of Rotterdam, who in the 16th century wrote this famous dialogue in which 2 characters discuss the original or ancient pronunciation of Greek and Latin. Now, Erasmus actually got most of it right. Indeed, the pronunciation system for ancient Greek that Erasmus reconstructs is in fact a good deal closer to the real thing than what you can hear in the average classroom where so-called Erasmian pronunciations are used. But due to the divergences enforced by ignorance in phonology in schools for centuries, it's not appropriate to call the theoretical model of Erasmus, which was closer to actual ancient Greek pronunciation, the Erasmian pronunciation, since now Erasmian has come to mean nothing more than the common academic pronunciation of ancient Greek in countries like Italy, France, Germany, Spain, and the UK, among others. And the way the Erasmian pronunciation is outlined in any given textbook from these places is usually laughably inadequate to actually represent the sound of ancient Greek in a meaningful way. The most heinous mistake found everywhere in the so-called Erasmian conventions is to say that epsilon iota is a diphthong, while making omicron upsilon u, not a diphthong. Now allow me to explain why this is so silly. Some epsilon iota digraphs stand where there used to be a true diphthong. For example, lege in Classical Attic. In pre-Classical Attic, it was legei. The infinitive, however, also spelled with epsilon iota in the standard orthography we use, well, it was never a diphthong. It was legein in Classical Attic, and it was legein also in pre-Classical Attic. It was never a diphthong. The spelling convention that we use, epsilon iota, is the same spelling convention that they used in Classical Attic to represent this long vowel. The exact same thing they did with omicron upsilon. Since e and a merged into the long monophthong e in pre-Classical Attic times, this is why they're all written in the same way as epsilon iota in standard orthography. And thus, if we pronounce any of them a, we're not only not classical, we're not even pre-classical for at least half of them. And we have the same story with omicron upsilon, which became a monophthong in pre-Classical Attic, o. Pronouncing either of these digraphs as a or o is wrong half the time etymologically, since only some of them were true diphthongs, and wrong for Classical Greek and the Common Greek that came out of it. Now that's bad enough, but the practice of Erasmian is usually much worse than the incorrect theory as outlined in textbooks. Take upsilon, u, and omicron upsilon, u. In most varieties of modern English, we don't have direct correspondences to these vowels. Indeed, we really only have one. We say oo or you. And whether it's oo or you depends on a lot of factors, including dialect. For example, Americans say tune, and Brits tend to say tune. Let's take the word scutu. That's in the Hellenian model of Classical Attic, of a Scythian. In Pompeian Lucian pronunciation, that's scutu. But the way this is taught in English language classrooms with Erasmian pronunciation is skuthu. This is an enormous problem because it merges two very different vowels that never merged at any time in the history of the Greek language. Skuthu is not an appropriate representation of the sound of ancient Greek if we're using some kind of historical phonology. Now, conventions are just conventions, and that's a big part of my discourse here today to explain how, well, convention is just a convention. The problem is that Erasmian is paraded around so frequently in these classrooms as the pronunciation of ancient Greek or of Attic, and that's a big problem because the practice is so far even from the theory, and the theory is wrong. And when it comes to second language acquisition, we can do so much better. Since the phonology is so important to the literature, this is why this matters. Italian Erasmian does this kind of thing too, rendering the upsilon as u. So scutu ends up sounding like sciutu. Not only do we have no recognition of the phonemic vowel length, the most critical part of the whole language, but we also have the mispronunciation of the theta. It's either ta or tha. It needs to be different from the way tau is pronounced. That doesn't happen in Italy. And of course, the vowel qualities are completely messed up. And this is just unacceptable. It doesn't meet the minimum requirement of representing the sound of ancient Greek. If we're using some kind of historical pronunciation, you can use a convention for all kinds of purposes, but if we want to enjoy what these authors were actually writing and how they sounded and how they expected us as the audience to appreciate their words, their poetry, their prose, then it's worthwhile to do a little bit better than this. Here's another sound that ends up being pretty embarrassing in Erasmian. English speakers pronounce epsilon upsilon, and that's eu in Classical Attic, as you. Well, that sounds like the other vowels that we were just looking at. So Europe is Europe. It's all wrong. And Germans make it Europa. They're not doing much better up there. And don't get me started on French Erasmian, which is a disaster. The problem is that these obvious mistakes are taught as the correct reconstruction of the language by teachers and textbooks. No wonder Greeks hate Erasmian. So what we're seeing is that Italians, Frenchmen, Germans, and Englishmen, among many others, are equating ancient Greek sounds with the equivalents in the native language, and then mistaking their native language sounds as the correct pronunciation of ancient Greek, and then reteaching that. This is a perfectly understandable phenomenon, but it's also abysmal. The true voices of Homer, Plato, Menander, Lucian are all suffocated under this mess of incorrect phonologies and bizarre conventions called Erasmian. And what I want to make absolutely clear here, especially for our friends in Greece, is that Erasmian pronunciation is not really one convention, but several, and all of them are typified by the native language influence of the speaker, and none of them are correct reconstructions of ancient Greek phonology. Oh, and we didn't even get to the most important part yet, the fact that Erasmian conventions virtually never observe either phonemic vowel length or pitch accent. And these two features are the soul of ancient Greek. While superficial qualities of consonants and vowels went through changes, like the aspirates changing to fricatives and the diphthongs changing into monophthongs, phonemic vowel length and pitch accent remained through the long, broad history of ancient Greek. They are core to the literature, the semantics, the grammar. Later we'll talk about exactly when phonemic vowel length and pitch accent begin to leave the language, but just to preview, it's at the end of antiquity. It's at the end of the Koine period. Now, if you study ancient Greek or teach ancient Greek and you have absolutely no interest in the sound of the language, I suppose it's fine to use the phonology of your native language, even though that's not something that we would ever do when teaching a modern language. Nevertheless, that is also true of most schools in Greece. They don't tend to care one bit about the ancient pronunciation and teach alarmingly often that modern Greek pronunciation is identical to that of ancient Greek. And in any case, they pronounce the letters exactly as modern Greek with no modifications. Thus, pitch, accent, and phonemic vowel length also go unexplored there. So Erasmian is named after Erasmus. Roiklinian is named after Reuchlin. Reuchlin espoused just using the modern Greek pronunciation. So we could call the practice of using the modern Greek pronunciation of letters for ancient Greek Reuchlinian pronunciation, or you could say that's just the modern Greek pronunciation used for ancient Greek, whatever you like. So the common problem in both the Erasmian and Reuchlinian pronunciations, that is the modern Greek pronunciation used for ancient Greek in studies in Greece, is that these conventions are applying alien phonologies to a foreign language. And I know that might seem strange from a modern Greek perspective because you think of ancient Greek as being the origin of the modern language, which is absolutely true, but it's still very different and it needs to be treated like a foreign language. We treat foreign languages with respect, learning about how they work as internal systems without imposing too many of our own preconceptions and habits on them if we can. So when it comes to foreign language studies, including ancient languages, using either Erasmian or Reuchlinian to me seems quite problematic. But it's much worse than that, since it serves to block us from appreciating any phonetic nuance employed by ancient authors, and boy did they do that a lot. This is why using a true reconstruction of ancient Greek phonology is so valuable. The sound of an author's native language is the fundamentally important feature of their work. And they take for granted that we, the readers, know it and are using it. As if we don't, we're missing the whole experience. Much like seeing a pale black and white photo of the Grand Canyon instead of hiking it. So neither Reuchlinian, aka modern Greek pronunciation, nor Erasmian in practice have any value whatsoever to ancient Greek other than the fact that they're traditional. They're just taught that way, they're learned that way. All right, I can accept that. There's still plenty of usefulness there, but they really don't have any utility when it comes to understanding the ancient phonology. Reuchlinian and Erasmian create copious numbers of mergers, and they both obscure comprehension of the original ancient Greek text as a result. Now, while a theoretical restored classical Attic is a wonderful option for working with ancient Greek, unfortunately, most people who attempt it don't even come close to rendering it properly. not because they aren't passionate about the true ancient pronunciation, but because they lack the linguistics or phonetics training to pull it off. This is where we have to talk about the aspirated stops. Kai, theta, phi, kata, pa are some of the coolest sounds in classical Attic, like etelo, aktomai, pilia, luknos. The problem is that contrasting aspirated stops, kata, pa, with unaspirated stops, gata, pa, doesn't occur in the native speech of hardly anyone who is learning ancient Greek. It's a totally alien concept. Italians and Spaniards, for instance, have a hell of a time. To start with, they don't have h, so they often mispronounce hama as chama. This is wrong. And when it comes to kai, theta, phi, kata, pa, they often make them the same as kata, pa. Or they turn kappa, tau, and pi into kata, pa. Others go to a different extreme, which we hear in German and English speakers. In these two languages, initial pt and k sounds must be aspirated. For example, pin versus spin. Now, pin and spin sound identical to most English speakers except for the initial s sound on spin, right? That's their only difference, we think. But they have another critical difference. Pin isn't written like this in IPA. That would be bin. Instead, in IPA, it's pin. That's our word. That's how we pronounce it. Pin, not bin. But because the P is not initial in spin, it's followed by the S, it's pronounced like that, spin. So in English, as in German, we have a single phoneme. We write it like this, a letter P, but it has an allophonic variation depending on where it comes in a word. Initially, it must be aspirated, p, but after an S, among other consonants, and if not before a stressed vowel, it must be unaspirated, p. It completely disobeys the laws of English phonology to say bin or spin. Those both sound bizarre. It's pin and spin, not bin and spin, right? Go ahead and try the reversed way yourself. It's not very easy. Yet, this is exactly what we have to master if we intend to use the aspirated stops of ancient Greek. Yet virtually no one has the time or the training to put in the work and to achieve this essential result. Thus, you'll hear someone say spallomai as spallomai. Don't hear much of a difference? You're probably a native English speaker. You'll also hear English speakers saying pos as pos. Those are completely different words. How and light should sound different because they do sound different in ancient Greek pronunciation. While these differences may seem subtle, they are not subtle in ancient Greek, or in Hindi, or Armenian, or Chinese. Those are just some living language examples. The illusion of their seeming subtle to us is merely our lack of familiarity with this critical phonological concept. And it's not our fault, we're just that way, and we have to work on it. The difference between k and k in classical Attic is just as critical as the difference between g and k in English. The difference between cat and gat. You gotta nail aspirates, and I mean really perfect them. You have to do them at least as well as a native speaker of Hindi or Chinese, because if you don't, it completely defeats the purpose of using a reconstructed Attic pronunciation or of doing another pronunciation variant that has them, like say Romaic or Alexandrine or Memphite. You have to get them absolutely perfect, because if there's any confusion, kai and gai need to sound different. Yet the allophonic aspiration that occurs in German and English is so fundamental to the way we use language that it's a very challenging thing to change. Sometimes speakers of English and German who aspirate initial K, T, and P sounds in their native languages use an affricate where they should have an aspirate when attempting to use the aspirated stops. Thus, instead of karis, they say karis. This is wrong if one intends to use classical Attic pronunciation. I know that the difference between karis and karis might sound subtle to you, but it's as significant a difference as what we hear in, say, a Spanish speaker who hasn't yet mastered English phonology. When they say hi, they might say chai. That's the same kind of phonetic error. And this leads to another huge problem imposed by well-meaning folks who just don't understand the details of phonology here. So take the word akaris. Since the chi is not in front of an accented vowel, the German-English tendency is to leave off the aspiration. Instead of saying akaris, they'll say akaris. Sounds real subtle, right? I want to emphasize that this is as different as jug and chug in English. It's a fundamental contrast. Yet, because it sounds subtle, the typical person, well-meaning, trying his best to realize that aspirate, will go too far, using an affricate, k, instead of the aspirate, k. Akaris. However, being unable to use a true affricate, which is a single sound, not two consonants, that's what this arc over the two symbols means. It means that they're just one consonant sound. They often make them two separate consonants, saying akaris. And this is absolutely terrible, since now the first syllable has been made long where it was short. Changing the length of syllables is not okay in ancient Greek, as the syllable and vowel lengths are the most fundamental part of the literature, especially if you're going for a classical Attic pronunciation. The whole point of using a reconstructed pronunciation is so that we get an intuition for the core phonology and thus have a chance at appreciating the rhythms and musicality of the author's speech. But the reality is that mastering aspirates, which, as I said, is a fundamental characteristic of ancient Greek pronunciation in the classical Greek period and classical Attic, is just as important as being able to distinguish the F sound from the V sound in English. It's just too hard for the vast majority of people who are studying ancient Greek. And until we cultivate a tradition where all classics departments train their faculty in linguistics and phonetics, we won't be able to instill the right practices in students either. As hopeful as I am for that day, I don't expect that to come anytime soon. Another difficult aspect of classical Attic phonology are the long diphthongs, I, oi. Most people attempting classical Attic just make them identical to I and oi, which results in endless confusion. Agroi and agroi end up sounding the same. Agroi, probably for both. This is not a merger any ancient Greek speaker would have done, and so it behooves us not to make such a grave mistake. Yet, this error is committed by virtually everyone who attempts classical Attic pronunciation. Like we talked about before, eta subscript iota, that long diphthong, a, it shouldn't create any confusion with epsilon iota because that's e in classical Attic. Yet, unfortunately, the Erasmian tradition to pronounce this digraph as a diphthong, a, is so ingrained that most of the people who are they're trying to use classical Attic pronunciation, yet they still pronounce epsilon iota as a. And they do that for both epsilon iota and the eta subscript iota. They pronounce them both as a when attempting classical Attic. It's a mess. Unlike classical Latin, which only has a few phonetic features hard to master for the majority of people who study it, and where these things aren't mastered, it doesn't create a lot of confusion, classical Attic has numerous phonemic contrasts, where most people learning it don't have the same phonemic contrast in their native language, and thus have no way of getting anywhere near classical Attic without years of intensive training. And that's why I don't generally recommend classical Attic pronunciation for those studying the language unless they've done advanced linguistic training and have worked on reducing or eliminating their native accent in at least one modern foreign language, so that they have a frame of reference, so that they understand how to work on their phonotactic limitations imposed by their native language. Otherwise, they'll have no chance of coming close to classical Attic. And this obstacle is one of the reasons that I hope to find a pronunciation in the history of the language that might be easier to master for the majority of people interested in working with ancient Greek. So I looked to the Koine period. Let's find out when those long diphthongs changed. Well, the long diphthongs, they definitely existed before the classical Latin period, which starts in the 1st century BC, and we know that because we have borrowings into Latin like gomoidia from gomoidia. Yet from the 1st century BC forward, new terms like rhapsodia from rhapsodia show that the long diphthongs had merged with their respective long vowels. Allen and Sturtevant show that the long diphthongs disappeared between 150 BC and 50 BC. As for those really challenging aspirates, we know they became fricatives by modern Greek. So, do we have evidence for their becoming fricatives before modern times? In fact, we do. Evidence exists for this during the classical Roman period, such as inscriptions found in Pompeii. This is encouraging. We might find the characteristics we desire for an ancient Greek pronunciation convention in the Koine period. So by exploring a phonology of ancient Greek, extant a few centuries after Classical Attic, I figured I might arrive at a sound system that could be much more easily produced by the majority of people who study the language, while having enough in common with Classical Attic, like phonemic vowel length and pitch accent, to make it a workable pronunciation when used with older literature. That is, it could be used with all ancient Greek literature. And the right time period for such a pronunciation seemed to be in the Classical Roman period. This appealed to me as a fluent Latin speaker because I really wanted to think about how these languages existed as living, vital, international languages at the height of their prestige. And that prestige was at its height in the 1st century AD, at the beginning of the Roman Empire, for both ancient Greek and Latin. Latin-speaking Romans learned Greek in school to appreciate the literature and the philosophy, but common merchants, Latin-speaking merchants, they needed to trade with Greek speakers in the Eastern Mediterranean, and also Greek speakers from the East. They had to learn Latin to work with anyone from the western part of the empire. My romantic imagination was captivated by the intermingling of these two amazing languages at their cultural zenith. In the original Plymouthie podcast, episode 1, A Voice in the Desert, I mused how wonderful it would be to use both languages in contemporary pronunciations. Say how both Latin and Greek sounded in the 1st century AD. So from the amount of information available to me at the time when I started this Lucian pronunciation project, it seemed the middle of the Koine period, contemporary with Classical Rome, would be the best place on the timeline to find a pronunciation system with the phonological characteristics I was looking for. But there already existed another Koine pronunciation. Dr. Randall Booth has spent decades democratizing the study of biblical languages, and has pioneered the teaching of Hebrew and Greek from the Bible in communicative and input-based approaches. And this led Dr. Booth to seek out a pronunciation system for Koine Greek that was contemporary with early Christian authors. Aware of the various spelling errors that can be found in Greek papyri of the period, he wanted to establish a workable phonology for the classroom based on how Greek was spoken by these scribes. Booth's convention is a highly innovative pronunciation of ancient Greek that is essentially the same as modern Greek, but it retains the U for omicron, iota, and the upsilon letters, and E for eta. The simplicity and beauty of Booth's pronunciation system has led to its adoption by many, especially biblical scholars, including my colleague Ben Cantor, who on his wonderful website, koinegreek.com, and YouTube channel of the same name, has explained, promoted, and taught in Randall Booth's pronunciation. I also recommend this video by Glossonauta, who has a beautiful New Testament reading in Booth's pronunciation. In his 2008 paper on this subject, Dr. Booth described the phonological system he was espousing as a pronunciation of Koine Greek, meaning all of it from the reign of Ptolemy in Egypt to the death of Justinian. Now, I knew that couldn't be right, though, that this Buthian pronunciation could be the pronunciation of the whole Koine period everywhere, in spite of the excellent scholarship that went into his original 2008 paper, due to the descriptions made by ancient Roman grammarians in Latin of the sound of contemporary Greek and of ancient Greek grammarians writing in Greek about the sound of Greek. I had the opportunity to discuss this a little bit some years ago with Dr. Booth, which is very generous of him. That was a few years ago. And his position at the time was that Greek had undergone a great sound shift by the 3rd century BC, and that this sound shift was complete before Greece was absorbed into the Roman Republic. That is, his pronunciation system was already the general Koine pronunciation before the advent of Classical Latin. Thus, he called it Koine pronunciation, or Koine, in fact, of course, using the Buthian pronunciation of that word, Koine, because that would be the pronunciation of essentially all speakers of Koine Greek for that 800-year period. Another term given to this is general Koine. But referring to this highly innovative sound system as the Koine pronunciation or as general Koine, that is misleading, I'm afraid, because I already knew before I had these conversations with Dr. Booth, who I esteem very highly, by the way, and his pronunciation system and all the work that went into it. I already knew, though, before we talked, that there are very clear descriptions by Greek and Roman grammarians of how contemporary Greek sounded to them, Plus, we have the transcriptions of Greek words into Latin by Roman authors. So the position that the highly innovative Buthian pronunciation was the general Koine pronunciation from Hellenistic times is just not a tenable one based on the evidence. For example, the Romans of the classical period transcribed alpha iota as AE, and that's pronounced I in Latin. So, for example, aiolos in a classical Attic pronunciation, that's aiolus in Latin. And omicron iota, that is rendered as OE in Latin, oi. For example, the classical Attic word oikos is oikus in Latin. Now, we know without a doubt that in classical Latin, AE and OE were true diphthongs. They were I and oi, respectively. And we know that from ample commentary from grammarians, among other sources of information. So just see Allen or Sturtevant or Jan Adams. Any number of sources can teach you about the pronunciation of classical Latin. Now, from our written discussions, Booth said that he was convinced that alpha iota had shifted to e and omicron iota had shifted to u by that time, before classical Latin came around, that there was a great vowel shift for all of Koine Greek. But since the classical Latin authors saw fit to import the Greek letter that we now call Y in English, that's the U sound in native Greek words. They needed it to write the Greek words that they were borrowing into Latin. Well, if that were the case, then the word oikus would in fact be written with a Y, and it would be pronounced ucus in Latin. And we wouldn't write aeolus in Latin, but aeolus. Dr. Booth could argue, and I believe he has argued this, that these are simply spelling pronunciations or somehow highly conservative renditions by the Romans. But that is also inconsistent with the inscriptional evidence in Latin. That is to say, the classical Latin evidence we have shows us that the Romans were highly descriptive of the Greek words that they were transcribing, spelling, and describing, that they were not prescriptive. For example, how did the ancient Romans render epsilon iota in Latin? Well, in front of a consonant, they wrote it as just a letter I, a long letter I. For example, Heraklitus. In classical Attic, that would have been Heraklitos. But by classical Roman times, the contemporary Greek pronunciation would have been Heraklitos. We also know that it definitely had a long vowel both in the Greek that it came from at the time and in the classical Latin, because, well, look at this quote from Lucretius. Heraclitus init quorum dux proelia primus. This is a line of hexameter. This is a piece of poetry, and Latin poetry, just like ancient Greek poetry, has the interchange of long and short syllables, long and short vowel sounds, as in Heraclitus. There's no other way this could be pronounced. If the Roman custom was just to use spelling pronunciations for all their Greek words, they would have rendered the name differently. They would have rendered it Herakleitos, with A if they were just sounding out all those letters. But no, they were descriptive in how they transcribed their contemporary Greek words into Latin. They would have done the same weird thing if they were just using a spelling pronunciation with a name like Xultus. They would have spelled it Xoutus instead. And we saw earlier how gomoidia in Latin, well, that's showing us an earlier stage of Koine Greek where the long diphthongs hadn't yet merged with their corresponding long vowels. While later borrowings like rhapsodia, they show that the Romans no longer heard a diphthong. These are descriptive, not prescriptive. And the great thing about all these pronunciation changes just mentioned of the epsilon iota, how that changes as well as the long diphthongs, all of these happen to correspond to contemporary ancient Greek grammarians who talk about these things and with spelling errors in Greek texts. While prescriptivism is something we should definitely keep in mind when looking at the data, the Roman evidence is definitely more descriptive. Here's another example of that. In the early 4th century AD, the grammarian who wrote the famous Appendix Probi, he admonishes amphora, non ampora. That is, since by then the fricative pronunciation of phi had become dominant in contemporary Greek, it did not make sense to pronounce it in the old-fashioned way, as a stop, aspirated or otherwise. In this and many other ways, we can see that the ancient Roman transcriptions and commentary from grammarians must be taken into account to give us a complete picture of the sound of Greek in the Koine period, and that we shouldn't necessarily assume too much from all of the spelling errors, especially if those spelling errors happen to be geographically isolated, and we'll look at that in a bit. I could happily concede to Dr. Booth that some Greek speakers spoke Greek in the Buthian pronunciation, even from an earlier century in the Koine period, until, of course, the Buthian pronunciation became dominant in late antiquity, and actually very late antiquity. And that's why I defend anybody who uses or promotes Buthian pronunciation, because it is a reconstruction of the sound of Greek in antiquity. But it clearly was not dominant in the classical Roman period, in the 1st century BC and the first 2 centuries AD. So what was the dominant sound of Koine Greek then? Raphael Torrigiano and I, in our original Lucian pronunciation video in 2020, give our proposal for an alternative Koine-era Greek pronunciation that was somewhat more conservative than Buthian pronunciation, in a way that could explain the contradictory evidence available. On the one hand, Booth was definitely right. The spelling errors from the Egyptian papyri showed that speakers there had a number of innovative traits, much like modern Greek. On the other hand, he couldn't be right. All these innovative traits could not possibly have been diffused in the entire Greek-speaking world yet. Otherwise, we would have seen clear traces of them in borrowings into classical Latin. Thus, the original Lucian pronunciation retained very narrow diphthongs a and u, and false diphthongs auv, euv, another transitional pair of sounds. These in-between sounds could actually explain how some people could hear this as av, ev, and other people could hear it as au, eu, right? The originally proposed Lucian pronunciation retained phonemic vowel length and syllable length, as well as pitch accent, all described clearly by Roman grammarians in their descriptions of contemporary Greek from the 1st century BC through the 2nd century AD. It also had a number of innovations in common with Buthian pronunciation, including all 6 fricatives. Yet it was apparent that this transitional variant of Lucian pronunciation that we were proposing couldn't explain all the evidence. A good example is the sound of gamma before front vowels in modern Greek, which is ye. Booth gave his pronunciation system the same sound, as Egyptian papyri show errors like hieru, huyu, herievs, meaning that gamma would have to sound roughly like the y, the yad sound, the j in IPA, to the scribes who wrote that very word. Raphael and I incorporated the same voiced velar fricative sound for gamma before front vowels into Lucian pronunciation. Yet, this couldn't be what Cicero heard when he wrote Diogenes. If gamma epsilon had that sound in his day, he would have used consonantal I, Diogenes. Here I've written it with a J. Thus, in our 2020 Lucian pronunciation proposal, we told the audience that they should feel free to develop their own more conservative or more innovative variants based on the central variant we were proposing. But we didn't explain exactly how someone might go about doing that. And as I continued my research into evidence for ancient Greek phonological attestations, and found stronger and stronger evidence that there existed more than one pronunciation variant of Koine in certain centuries and certain geographies, I had a clearer idea of what types of discrete phonologies actually existed. And as I made more recordings in Lucian pronunciation, I gathered useful feedback from people around the world. So I decided it would be a good idea to prescribe a few pronunciation variants into the Lucian pronunciation system to offer a broader picture of the sound of Koine, and to give those who work with ancient Greek more options to choose from, while finding a pronunciation based on historical evidence that works for them. The Romaic variant of Lucian pronunciation started as a further extension of the thought experiment I mentioned earlier. What did ancient Greek sound like in classical Rome? The usual Lucian pronunciation variant I had been using up to that point, which is now called Samosatene Lucian, had some challenging phonetics for most people, which I learned thanks to the feedback I was receiving, especially from those who already speak classical Latin. Now, I'll address those challenges later when we talk about Samosatene Lucian. So I thought, okay, since many people can pronounce classical Latin pretty well, what if they had an ancient Greek convention they could use that was essentially the same basic sound inventory of their Latin? Said differently, what would Greek sound like with a Roman accent, with Latin phonotactic limitations? In reality, the Romans had already pushed themselves beyond their phonotactic limitations by importing letters upsilon and zeta to spell Greek words, and innovating the digraph ch, th, ph for the aspirates, as well as rh for the voiceless r. So let's do an experiment. Let's write some ancient Greek in the Roman alphabet. Let's do it with that sample of a true story by Lucian that I recited earlier, and let's just transcribe it in the classical Latin alphabet in the usual way that Greek words were spelled in Latin. We'll just add some pitch accent marks and pronounce the pitch accent correctly, and, well, here we go. Hos pertois athleticois cae peritenton maton epimelean ascolumenois, utes euexias monon udeton gymnasion prontis estin, allegaites catagairongi nomenes aneseos, meroscuntes asceseos tomegiston auten hypulamban usin. Huto de caetois peritus logus espudacosin, hegumai prosecin metaten polendon spudaeoteron anagnosin, anienai deten dianoian, cae proston epi tacamaton acmaeoteran parasceoazin. So this happens to be a convenient sound system for those who have already mastered classical Latin phonology. But its validity as a historical representation of the sound of ancient Greek is also confirmed by multiple other sources, in addition to the raw inscriptional evidence of Greek words in Latin. Threet's Grammar of Attic Inscriptions gives the same system for 1st century BC Attic as does Theodorson's Phonology of Attic in the Hellenistic period. Benjamin Cantor's recent book, The Pronunciation of New Testament Greek, which I lauded and recommended on the secondary channel in this review that you can check out later, it tracks the changing pronunciation of Greek in Judea during the Koine period, and his studies independently confirm that the same system that I call Romaic Lucian pronunciation is the late Hellenistic sound of Greek in Judea up to the 1st century BC. So 2 studies of Hellenistic Attic, one of Judean Koine, and the ancient Roman transcriptions of Greek words borrowed into Latin, plus extensive commentary from Roman and Greek grammarians, all confirmed that the sound of Greek at the dawn of the Roman Empire, still following the model of Attic, which had never lost its prestige and was still imitated abroad even as it changed, was probably very much like the Romaic Lucian pronunciation. Though that probably wasn't the only pronunciation at the time, which we'll examine later when we get to Egypt. The transcription and corresponding recitation I gave a moment ago is the prescribed Romaic variant, which is as close as possible to a one-to-one correspondence of Latin sounds in the Greek, including those sounds borrowed into Latin from Greek like ph, th, ch, rh, y, and z, with the only difference being pitch accent. This prescribed convention of Romaic Lucian uses the diphthongs of Latin, I, oi, au, eu, since the Romans identified whatever they heard in Greek voices, who were making similar sounds, with these diphthongs that were in Latin. However, that doesn't mean that the diphthongs in Attica and Judea were necessarily exactly like the reconstruction of the equivalent diphthongs in classical Latin. A number of small variations are possible in the diphthongs and in many aspects of the phonetics, which we'll talk about later. The point is that this is a convention that gets very close to the sound of Greek as spoken by Cicero in Rome, as spoken by Gorgias of Athens, and as spoken by the apostles in Judea. And Romaic Lucian isn't that different from classical Attic pronunciation. Its key differences are that the zeta is a geminated z, the long diphthongs are all monophthongs, and that the epsilon iota is e before consonants, like in Heraklitos, Heraklitus, like we saw in Lucretius, but otherwise it's merged with eta before vowels, as in Deiopeia in Virgil. The overall inventory of vowel quality is somewhat simpler than what we had in classical Attic. Epsilon and eta are short and long versions of the same vowel quality, as are omicron and omega. In addition to this being the likely pronunciation of these vowels in contemporary Attic, this also happens to be the same basic vowel inventory of classical Latin, if we include the borrowed U, the Y letter from Greek, borrowed into Latin for Greek words. Now in this video, I'm not seeking to establish evidence for the classical Attic pronunciation. For that, see Allen and Sturtevant and the various other sources I cited earlier, or my other videos that cover the topic. In this section on commentary for each variant, I intend to show some pieces of evidence for how the pronunciation has changed from classical Attic, and show how those changes have been incorporated into each convention. Now this presentation of evidence will only be exemplary, not exhaustive, as there are often hundreds of similar examples, and this video is already long enough as it is. For a more extensive analysis and commentary, I refer you to the sources cited. So how do we know that epsilon iota underwent a split into e before consonants and a before vowels? In addition to the Latin transliteration evidence, which we talked about earlier, we can observe parallel phenomena in Greek spelling errors in both Attica and Judea. Epsilon iota is frequently confused with long iota before consonants from the 3rd century BC, such as in ginestai for ginestai, pronounced the same but spelled differently. The second spelling there, that's the regular Koine spelling for gignestai, and that was written in 183 or 182 BC in Attica. Before vowels, however, Attic inscriptions show eta for epsilon iota from the 3rd century BC forward. For example, Pritanean for Pritanean, pronounced the same of course, inscribed circa 50 to 40 BC. Theodorus in 1978 shows similar examples and demonstrates also how these spelling errors and others account for the vowel inventory shift where epsilon and eta have the same quality and differ only in length, ditto omicron and omega. And Cantor 2023 demonstrates a parallel distribution of spelling errors in the Judean evidence. So how do we know the long diphthongs monophthongized to merge with their long vowel counterparts? Well, in addition to the commentary by Dionysius Thraxus said that the iota subscript, well, what we think of iota subscript, was purely orthographical and not pronounced, we have numerous spelling errors of both types. For example, the omitted iota, as in trago dois for tragoi dois, and we also have a superfluous iota written, such as in toi teoi, though it wouldn't have been pronounced that way, since it was just standing for to teo, and the iota in this position was simply silent. And Cantor gives similar data for Judea. In addition to the ancient Roman commentary, like that of Velius Longus, that describes the pronunciation of zeta as being z, a long geminated z sound, Attic inscriptions show zeta taking the place of sigma, such as in Irgasmenon, that was written in 342 or 341 BC. And we see other similar spelling errors in Theodorson and Cantor. While Romaic Lucian seems to be a rather accurate historical reconstruction of the sound of Greek in the 1st century BC in Rome, Attica, and Judea, it still has aspirates, which we established earlier are terribly difficult for most students of ancient Greek to produce. Plenty of people speak an excellent classical Latin pronunciation, but can readily botch aspirates if they want, the ph, the th, the ch, without causing significant problems in spoken Latin communication because these digraphs are so rare, and almost all of them are just used for the few words that are borrowed from Greek. Many Latin speakers merge them readily with the unaspirated equivalents. So instead of pilosopus, pilosopus. Instead of theseus, theseus. Instead of carta, carta. And that's actually a pretty natural thing that ancient Latin speakers probably would have done. They would have used their native sound where it corresponds to the foreign sound. While other Romans almost certainly trained themselves to pronounce these Greek sounds in Latin because that's why they borrowed the letters into Latin. Thus, Romaic Lucian pronunciation has a great deal of strengths, but still demands a lot of the speaker today because of those aspirated stops. So where might we find evidence for the aspirated stops having become fricatives in the historical record? We don't have to travel that far. In Pompeii, we have a smattering of inscriptions that I highlighted in this video about the fricatives phi, theta, chi, which you should take a look at after you see this if you want a more detailed picture of this change, that show Greek words spelled in Roman letters like daphne for daphne, so daphne, lasfe for laste, so lasthe. Whoever wrote these words was acquainted with a pronunciation of Koine Greek that had fricatives for phi and theta. Was this the dominant pronunciation in Pompeii? Were the fricatives inherited from the non-Attic colonists who settled the area before Roman dominance in the region? Were fricatives the regular pronunciation in other parts of Italy besides Pompeii? What about back in Greece or elsewhere? I have no idea. What is of value to us, however, is that we have the attestation of a historical phonology that has fricatives instead of aspirated stops, and this is of immense utility for classroom instruction due to the difficulty of aspirates for most students of ancient Greek, as we discussed earlier. However, chi doesn't have any unusual treatment in the inscriptions in Pompeii to suggest that there it had already become a fricative, though there aren't any types of spelling errors like lasfe or daphne that would occur for the letter chi, so when one or two of the aspirates becomes a fricative, many scholars accept the possibility that all three have made the switch, though that isn't necessarily true, and we'll discuss that later. Other than this being a reasonable hypothetical reconstruction, Pompeian Lucian has fricatives for all three former aspirated stops as a matter of ease of convention. As I said earlier, all these variants are conventions. They're meant to be somewhat discrete points on the continuum of change in Koine phonology. And while Pompeii itself doesn't have evidence for fricative chi, we can extrapolate that it existed in the 1st century BC, at least for some speakers in Italy, on a number of pieces of evidence. These were already explored in the Phi Theta Chi video, but an interesting one worth mentioning is the Cherusci Germanic tribe, among many other tribes that had this CH in their name. So the name Cherusci, this is understood to have derived from the name of the tribe in the Germanic language, and the Germanic root that this is associated with is Cheru, that is an initial Ch in the Germanic language. This is really significant because the Romans and the Greeks that transcribed this name into their languages, they didn't use the equivalent of Latin H. They didn't use a H sound. They used, well, the chi. So if this were a Ch, and if Latin speakers like Caesar knew that some Greeks pronounced the chi as a Ch, then it would make sense why they would use this CH digraph so easily for this dramatic name and so many others. Then there's Sextus Empiricus. He was a 2nd century Greek grammarian, and wherever he was from, he probably lived in Rome for part of his life. And assuming that's true, he probably heard what Greek sounded like not only where he came from, but in the vicinity of Italy. Well, he wrote something very interesting about semivowels and stops. So, semivowel in the ancient Greek grammar concept are letters that can be uttered continuously. So, l, r, s. Those are semivowels. They had a continuous pronunciation. That is, they weren't stops like p, th, k. They all had a buzzing or a hissing sound, he says, and in the list, he includes phi, theta, and chi. Well, that sounds a lot like f, th, ch in that description. But even more interesting, he says that some pronounce them as semivowels, with a hissing and buzzing, but others pronounce them as stops, as aspirated stops. Assuming this interpretation of the quote is correct, it means we have attestation from the classical Roman period that there were 2 ways to pronounce phi, theta, chi contemporaneously, justifying Romaic Lucian and Pompeian Lucian as contemporary variants. There's another way we can interpret this quote by Sextus Empiricus that we'll look at later. The final difference in Pompeian Lucian is that epsilon iota has been closed to e in all positions. This choice was made to reflect the innovation in this digraph that was happening in the 1st century BC and AD. In spelling errors in Greek texts, we see that epsilon iota, even before vowels, is increasingly confused with long iota, and in Latin transcriptions we can observe spellings such as Alexandria for earlier Alexandrea, becoming more common towards the end of the 1st century. This is also an easier pronunciation rule from a practical point of view for us, since you don't have to pay attention to whether a vowel follows or not when reciting. Further evidence for this as a general change in Koine is found in Attic inscriptions, whereas epsilon iota was replaced by eta in Hellenistic times, meaning it retained a mid-vowel quality. By 100 AD, this phenomenon vanished, and epsilon iota is replaced by just iota before vowels, as well as consonants. Thus, this has been made a feature of the Pompeian variant of Lucian pronunciation. To name one example, Thalia for Thalia. Or indeed, in Pompeii, it would have been pronounced Thalia. This makes Pompeian Lucian somewhat similar to many types of Erasmian pronunciation. Fricatives for just chi, theta, and phi, not for gamma, beta, delta. One accustomed to Erasmian need only tune up phonetic vowel length and pitch accent, making Pompeian Lucian pronunciation one of the easiest transitions for anyone wishing to leave Erasmian behind. I find it really interesting that neither Sextus Empiricus nor the inscriptions at Pompeii give any indication that the voice stops gamma, delta, beta had become fricatives as in modern Greek, radava. But as far as data in Italy are concerned, there is the Leon paper from 1927. So Harry Joshua Leon analyzed the inscriptions in the Jewish catacombs in Rome, and they were probably made in the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. One thing he was looking for was the possible fricativization and palatization of initial gamma into ya, like in modern Greek. Also attested contemporaneously at this point in Egyptian Koine. But after looking at the evidence, he dismisses this possibility in the Jewish catacomb inscriptions because he believes spelling errors of a semantic type are the cause and not a pronunciation-based spelling error. Moreover, there's zero evidence for the fricative or palatalized gamma in any of the other inscriptions where it would be expected. Though Ben Cantor in Pronunciation of New Testament Greek disagrees with Leon, since the fricative and palatalized gamma was extant elsewhere in the Greek-speaking world at this time, like in Egypt, as we mentioned, but I still think Leon's assessment that the Jewish catacombs show stops for gamma, beta, and delta is the right conclusion. But that said, where were these letters fricatives? Oh yeah, I already spoiled it, but let's go to Egypt. Welcome to Egypt. The richest treasure trove of papyri of informal Koine Greek can be found right here. And there are lots of spelling errors in these texts. Gignac's book on the subject is the main source. Egyptian Koine shows spelling errors consistent with many types of sound changes as we discussed earlier, spirantization of beta, delta, and gamma, including the yad sound equivalent for gamma before front vowels, making ye as in modern Greek. Egyptian Koine also shows the monophthongization of alpha iota and omicron iota, I and oi, into e and u, and also the change of au, eu into av and ev, most likely, and even the loss of the rough breathing, the h sound. Well, how can we possibly know all that? Latin V and later intervocalic B start to become V in Latin in the 1st century AD, for which see the evidence provided by J.N. Adams in Social Variation in the Latin Language, and corresponding Greek transcriptions of Latin words begin to use beta for this sound at this time, such as in salviu, 1st century AD, from Latin salvius. The fricative nature of the Greek sound at this time is confirmed by spellings such as pneotunis for pnebtuni from 35 or 36 AD, and hedomo for hebdomu, probably hebdomu, and that's from 46 or 47 AD. Gamma's fricativization is especially well attested with examples such as hugiu for huiyu, thus huiyu is the assumed pronunciation, and huiainin for hugiainin, thus huiainin. These are especially fascinating examples because we may conclude the sound of gamma in this environment is y, a voiced palatal fricative, meaning that gamma has become a fricative, and that all velars, kappa, chi, and gamma, must therefore be palatalized before front vowels. Delta may have been the last of fricative I's, first only when followed by an iota, such as in zakosias for diakosias, suggesting diakosias as the pronunciation, that's from 268 or 269 AD, eventually becoming a fricative in all positions by Byzantine times. Psilosis, the loss of the H sound, is especially well demonstrated in examples such as katekasten he meran for katekasten he meran, as well as false aspiration, katetos for katetos, in 26 BC. The monophthongization of alpha iota is seen in abundant examples such as ga for gai, suggesting ga, from 26 AD, as well as ge for gai in 3 AD. And that spelling could indeed mean ge, though it could also mean ga. Both are possible interpretations. Omicron iota has a similar monophthongization, such as oku for oiku in 47 AD, suggesting ö, as well as uku for oiku in 18 AD, and that would mean u as the pronunciation here. Alpha upsilon is often misspelled to just alpha, such as in atu for autu in 75 AD, which indicates au changed to au, and then the w component could go unwritten or was lost in speech. Epsilon upsilon has a similar simplification, deteru for deuteru in 8 BC, again suggesting the loss of final w in speech or its omission in writing. In other speakers, alpha upsilon and epsilon upsilon may have become av, ev, and once these diacritics gained that association, well, then scribes who wished to emphasize the traditional pronunciation began to write autu for autu, which is an example from 31 AD, and hypograpeus for hypograpeus. In any case, these data make a strong case for multiple phonological systems in the same geography, perhaps stratified by class, in the same time period. That's really exciting stuff, and taking it to its logical conclusion leads one to reconstruct a highly innovative phonology for Koine Greek. The copious nature of these papyri and their spelling errors have allowed Egyptian Koine to stand in for Koine in various studies, including those by Horrocks and Booth. This is probably a bit of sampling error, though. Egypt's dry desert preserved a huge quantity of informal texts, and since the resolution of the data is so high, it's tempting to extrapolate a phonological system from these spelling errors that we might use to assign grand sound shifts to the entire language to an early period. And I believe that to be a mistake, since we've discussed earlier that a Buthian-type pronunciation, or one based on the most innovative interpretation of the Egyptian papyri, is aggressively at odds with other contemporary attestations in Attica, Judea, and Italy. It's also at odds with another local bit of evidence in Egypt itself, the Coptic language. Coptic is the final stage of ancient Egyptian, and its first writings came into being around the 3rd century AD. Coptic very notably borrows Greek letters phi, theta, and chi for its native aspirated stops, p, t, k. This would seem to suggest that Greek in Egypt retained the aspirates well into the Roman period. However, Coptic does have f and ch, but it didn't use Greek letters for these sounds. Coptic scribes had to go to Demotic script and take the letters from f and ch that were originally from hieroglyphs. The Greek papyri in Egypt also don't show any interchanges of the phi and the theta and the chi that would suggest that they had become fricatives. On the contrary, where there are spelling errors involving phi, theta, and chi, these errors show that these letters are still indeed plosives in Egypt. Thus, we can conclude that the Greek spoken in Egypt in the Koine period never had phi, theta, and chi as fricatives, and that's really important. Coptic also had diphthongs, ai, oi, au, eu, and it readily used the Greek diphthongs in its orthography without any need to reinterpret the spelling of the Greek diphthongs as if the Greek diphthongs had already monophthongized in local Greek, even though many have interpreted some spelling errors in the Greek papyri to mean just that they should have already become monophthongs. Thus, we have a paradox. Coptic orthography, at its inception in the 3rd century AD, reveals a pronunciation system of local Egyptian Greek that's more conservative than what we saw at Pompeii, it seems, at least for the Aspirates, right? And yet some Greek papyri in Egypt, they show all kinds of innovations, much more evolved than the stuff at Pompeii, and some of those Egyptian papyri remain 200 years before the stuff at Pompeii. So what's going on? And more than that, the papyri don't lead to the inevitable conclusion that, say, alpha iota has merged with epsilon. Indeed, about as frequently, the Egyptian papyri show us alpha iota as merged with plain old alpha. If we assume Koine Greek anywhere was evolving inexorably towards modern Greek, then it's fair to interpret all of these as just monophthongization towards A, and we could ignore anomalies like just the plain old alpha. But that's not a reasonable assumption, given that the dispersed geography of the dialects means that their separate evolutions didn't necessarily contribute to the sound of modern Greek at all. Modern Greek was perfectly capable of getting that way on its own in Greece with no help from other places. And the fact that the spelling errors in the papyri of Egypt never show evidence for the fricativization of phi, theta, chi, something that obviously occurred in the antecedent to modern Greek, well, that means that Egyptian Koine can be treated as a separate entity. So given the paradoxical information we have, even in just the papyri, we can come to the conclusion that the Greek in Egypt was probably quite various, and likely had developments that were quite strange when compared with the linear evolution of ancient Greek into modern Greek. In an attempt to represent the variety of these voices, I prescribed 2 variants for Egyptian Koine, Alexandrine Lucian and Memphite Lucian. Alexandrine Lucian is more conservative, and it has ai, oi, au, eu for its diphthongs. Technically, the realization here of these is as false diphthongs since they end in a consonant sound instead of a vowel aufglide, although acoustically they're almost indistinguishable from true diphthongs. In addition to these false diphthongs being a good reconstruction of the sound of Coptic, it's also a reasonable alternative reconstruction of ancient Greek, even in classical Attic Greek. For example, you may know that final diphthongs alpha iota and omicron iota aren't considered long when they are syllable final. For example, the word for people, anthropoi in classical Attic pronunciation. The dative singular of this word is anthropoi. The accent shifts due to the rule that says that if the final vowel is long, the pitch accent can only occur on the final or penultimate syllable. Yet even though anthropoi ends in a long vowel, all diphthongs are considered long vowels, the accent doesn't shift. How come? Well, for the same reason that the accent doesn't shift on the nominative singular, anthropos. The final vowel is short in the nominative singular, and it's also short in the nominative plural. Here, let me rewrite it with the Latin J, anthropoi. This is a better representation of the phonemes. There isn't any doubt that omicron iota and also alpha iota, when final, were really vowel plus consonant, not diphthongs. And this interpretation works too for other positions in the word. Vox-Graeca has more on this. And in any case, this is their realization in Alexandrine Lucian. Memphite Lucian, meanwhile, evolves them towards their modern Greek equivalents, but not as far as in Antiochene Lucian. A, U, Av, Ev. The reason that these are slightly less innovative is to account for a lot of those spellings that we see in the Egyptian papyri, though it's entirely possible that the vowel qualities would have become, in fact, more like Antiochene Lucian. We'll talk more later about how you can play with these options. The Alexandrine variant has the h sound, as this sound exists in Coptic, and borrowings into Coptic like hirene, peace, from the Greek he irene, contracted into hirene in fast speech. But in the Memphite variant, the rough breathing is silent. Other than these differences, both Egyptian variants have these features in common. Aspirated stops for phi, theta, chi, as mentioned before. Fricatives for beta, delta, gamma, as in modern Greek. Also, as in modern Greek, palatalization of velars before front vowels, ke, ge, ye. This is also a good time to mention that for all variants that have fricative gamma, delta, and beta, when preceded by a nasal, the fricative is occluded back into a stop. The pronunciation of the following words will be valid for both Alexandrine and Memphite pronunciations. Gonea, ton gonea, angelos, didomi, tu ton didomi, andres, varvaron, ton barvaron, lambano. And one other characteristic of these two variants that is observed in Coptic is the vowel quality inventory. Coptic has e, o. These are open and close counterparts, respectively. And it's the exact opposite of how they are in Classical Attic. And this is most likely because the Greek spoken in Egypt at the time had a closed eta and a closed omega, but an open epsilon and an open omicron. Therefore, the Alexandrine and Memphite variants have these pronunciations, e, o, u. And now we come back home to Samosata. This was Lucian's hometown, and it seems appropriate for it to bear the name of the variant that Raphael Torrigiano and I originally prescribed as the Lucian pronunciation. Samosatene Lucian has all 6 fricatives. Ra, tha, va, cha, tha, fa. Phi and beta are both bilabial fricatives instead of the labiodental fricatives of modern Greek, since these are slightly more conservative in the chain of sound changes. Their being bilabial also allows them to partially merge with the false diphthongs for alpha hypsilon and epsilon hypsilon, au, auf, euf, which are also transitional sounds in the chain. A phonology like this, depending how diffused it was, could be interpreted by some ears as more similar to the conservative au, eu, and others, and the more innovative av, af, ev. Thus, if this pronunciation were dominant, it could explain a lot of conflicting evidence and spelling errors and transcriptions that we covered earlier. And in any case, these sounds are all part of the historical sound changes for these letters, so they get represented here. While we can accept auf and elf as the linguistically determined transitional stages of these diphthongs, inscriptional evidence of the type flaviu for the genitive of Latin flavius in 120 AD and porieutes or porieuthes in 6 AD suggests this exact pronunciation. Other innovations, notably the spirantization of gamma, delta, beta, chi, theta, and phi, are all the final result of these letters in medieval and modern Greek naturally. Earlier evidence for all of them exists in several locations besides Egypt and Italy, as previously discussed, and even in classical Greece, such as a fricative theta in Doric, teasingly characterized by Aristophanes as sios for theos, thus theos, io for ego in Boeotian, thus ego, or if we take it at face value, the gamma there has already vanished from the word, so io. Aeolic may have had fricative delta, such as in Sappho's zapoitaisa for diapoitesa in Attic. All these and more are found in 2nd century BC Pamphylian Greek in Asia Minor, including pikati for we kati, so fikati. There are also spelling changes of the type archibaku for archibaku, taken to be the fricativization of chi, so archibaku. In addition to the transitional stage of the alpha hypsilon and epsilon hypsilon diphthongs, alpha iota and omicron iota also have peculiar realizations, very narrow diphthongs, almost monophthongs, but not quite. I, ui. Both of these are perfectly reasonable from a linguistic point of view, and the spelling errors could indeed indicate something like that. For example, 2nd century AD Syrian inscription eokodomesen for oikodomesen. This probably was something like uikodomesen, and they just did their best using the letters available to spell that sound. In addition to these being part of the chain of historical sound shifts, there's a practical reason for the narrow diphthongs I and U, as well as the pseudo-diphthongs AV and EUV. And that has to do with a big point of difficulty in comprehension, in spoken comprehension between speakers of Classical Attic or Erasmian type pronunciations and those that use a Buthian pronunciation or a Reuchlinian pronunciation, a modern Greek type pronunciation. These 4 classical diphthongs, alpha iota, omicron iota, alpha hypsilon, and epsilon hypsilon, they're super common in the ancient Greek language. So if you pronounce them one way or the other, it can be an absolute obstacle for comprehension. One of the commonest words in the whole language is this one. In the classical Attic pronunciation, it's autoi, and in the Buthian pronunciation, it's aftu. Autoi, aftu. They sound completely different. Now imagine words like that are flying all the time in speech and in recitation. It's a huge obstacle to understanding one another. But in Samosatene Lucian, it sounds like this. Auftoi. Here are all three in historical order. Autoi, auftoi, aftu. Or in reverse historical order. Aftu, auftoi, autoi. This is a significant part of the utility of the Samosatene variant. If you hear a word in Samosatene, in this case auftoi, and you're used to Buthian pronunciation, you can mentally interpret auftoi as aftu, the word that you're familiar with. And that's also true if you're used to using the classical Attic pronunciation. You hear auftoi, but you mentally interpret that as autoi. In general, Samosatene Lucian sounds sufficiently like either group's regular pronunciation to be comprehensible to both. This was one of the reasons that this convention was the original standard of Lucian pronunciation. But certain subtleties in Samosatene are difficult to master. This prompted the development of the other variants that you've now become acquainted with in this video. These other variants are also helpful, of course, to broaden our picture of the sound of Greek in the whole Koine period all across the Mediterranean. One note on the narrow diphthongs I and oi. In the original Lucian pronunciation proposal that Raphael Torrigiano and I made back in 2020, we actually presented these as I and oi. That is, the first component of the diphthong wasn't necessarily a front vowel in either case. Now, it is entirely possible that they could still have the interesting effect that we wanted them to have, which was to be able to palatalize preceding velars, but this is something that I decided to modify essentially immediately after we had published that original article and that video, because I found that it was actually a huge improvement to use this I and oi for a number of different reasons, aesthetically, and also because it's that much easier to automatically palatalize the velars that come before these. In fact, this is what we originally wanted to do, but we decided against it for the original proposal because we wanted to have the simplest kinds of vowels possible and not introduce too much complexity. But like I said, I really found that the narrow diphthongs I and oi work better for this variant. So that's how they're prescribed now as Samosatene Lucian. The Samosatene variant retains the rough breathing h, and it also palatalizes velars, like I was just mentioning, before front vowels. This is just like the Egyptian variants and also like modern Greek. The vowel inventory is mostly the same as that in the Romaic and Pompeian variants, except for the differences in diphthongs that we already covered. So what else is special about Samosata's geography to lend its name to this variant? Well, Western Asia, such as in Anatolia and Syria, that's where many innovations, including fricativization of chi and the other aspirates, as well as voice stops, may have actually occurred earlier, and this is assumed by Schweitzer, among other scholars. Schweitzer actually puts this in the 1st century BC for these changes. It's really incredible. So that's why Samosata, which is in this region, is a perfectly good nickname for this variant, and that's why the final variant also bears the name of a city in this region. The Antiochene variant of Lucian pronunciation embraces almost all of the innovations that can be heard in Buthian pronunciation, and it could be considered a more innovative version of Samosatene, having all 6 fricatives, ra, tha, va, cha, tha, fa. The diphthongs are all monophthongized, e, u, av, or af, ev, or f, while epsilon and alpha iota have the same quality, e. Eta is a high e. The rough breathing is silent, as in Buthian pronunciation. Thus, Antiochene Lucian sounds very much like Buthian, but has those key features common to all variants of Lucian pronunciation. Phonemic vowel length and pitch accent are intact. These are, of course, the ultimate realizations of all these sounds by medieval Greek. And we can see this sort of phonology in Syria in the 2nd AD inscription, which has master for magister, from the Latin magister. And in the same inscription, Geta anagen for gaito anagaion. And I'm really happy that Lucian pronunciation as a system can include a variant that is so similar sounding to Buthian pronunciation because, like I said, the scholarship that went into developing Buthian pronunciation is phenomenal. My only problem is that it can't possibly represent the sound of Koine in the majority of its history or in the majority of its geographies, but it most definitely is representative of a sound of ancient Greek at least one point in its history. Buthian pronunciation itself follows. This would be like taking Antiochene and removing the phonemic vowel length and pitch accent and the geminated consonants or any syllable length phonemic distinctions. Thus, Buthian represents a yet more innovative stage in the development of Koine Greek. While I have a very high opinion of the aesthetic qualities of Buthian pronunciation, like I've said, there's an ancient quote cited by Ben Cantor on page 24 of his Pronunciation of New Testament Greek that really stood out to me when I read it, and it reveals something really important in this discussion. The 1st century BC quote is by Meleager of Gadara, and Cantor gives a lovely translation that helps one understand the multilingual context of the ancient Middle East. But if you're a Syrian, salam. Now if instead you're a Phoenician, audonis. But if you're a Greek, kaire. But in each case, you say the same thing. Here is the original Greek, which I'll recite in Buthian pronunciation. Alimensurasesi salam, idun suye phoenix, avdonis, idelin, here, to thafto phrason. Ben Cantor placed the original Greek text in a line like this in the footnotes, and there's nothing wrong with this presentation. The only problem is that if you acquired ancient Greek via the Buthian pronunciation, you would have no idea that this is actually a poem written in elegiac couplet. Now I'll recite it in the Antiochene variant of Lucian pronunciation. Ali mensurosessi salam, idun suye phoenix, avdonisi delin, here to daphtophorason. An elegiac couplet is a metrical form where the first verse is in dactylic hexameter and the second verse is in dactylic pentameter. This is one of the commonest of all metrical forms in all ancient Latin and Greek poetry. Now I'll recite it in monotone, only pausing at the end of each line so that you can hear the interplay of the rhythm of long and short syllables. Ali mensurosessi salam idun suye phoenix, avdonisi dellen here to daphtophorason. So in that entirely artificial monotone way of reciting, hopefully you were able to hear the interchange of long and short syllables. That's something that, spoken in a natural way, but retaining the phonemic vowel length, that is still completely evident to the native speaker of ancient Greek, where there is phonemic vowel length, including obviously this poet. I've demonstrated before how to recite ancient Greek poetry, such as in this video, with the example being the Iliad, but let's go forward with this and continue with this. So it's in monotone, right? Now what we're going to do is just add the pitch accents back and only do them on a single higher note. We're only going to have 2 notes in this whole little song that we're putting together. Ali mensurosessi salam, idun suye phoenix, avdonisi dellen here to daphtophorason. Of course, that is a highly artificial way to recite this poem. That's just a training way to recite it. Now let's go back to reciting it in a completely normal way in the Antiochene Lucian pronunciation in a spoken manner, but listen for those long and short syllables. Ali mensurosessi salam, idun suye phoenix, avdonis, idellen here to daphtophorason. Naturally, as you read ancient Greek poetry in this spoken manner, it's entirely okay to put pauses where they make sense. But now you can probably hear the structure of the phrase, the structure of the elegiac couplet of dactylic hexameter plus dactylic pentameter. My first time seeing this Greek poem was there in the footnotes of Ben Cantor's book. As I read it silently in Lucian pronunciation, I immediately knew it was in dactylic hexameter thanks to the natural rhythms of short and long syllables that I was feeling in my head. And then I decided to read it aloud, and I was delighted to feel the music of the words of this ancient poet come back to life for a moment there to fill the room. I have no idea if that poet, Meleager of Gadara, used a pronunciation like Antiochene, or if he used something like Samosatene or like Alexandrine. Most likely, since it was 1st century BC, it would have probably sounded something more like Romaic Lucian pronunciation, but it doesn't matter. The point of my using the most innovative of the variants of Lucian pronunciation in the demonstration that I just gave you in Antiochene Lucian, A variant that is almost identical to Buthian pronunciation, extremely close to modern Greek, is that you can still use a variant, a highly innovative variant, to work with the poetry, with the literature of essentially any period, and extract the most important juice out of that literature, which are these rhythms, which is the music, the interplay of syllable and pitch accent. All of ancient Greek poetry is organized according to these principles: the rhythm of long and short syllables in a specific sequence, the flourish of pitch accent that adorns it all, from epic Greek to Koine Greek. Had I only learned ancient Greek in the Buthian or Romaic pronunciation, I would never have been able to appreciate what this Koine Greek author intended me to hear. And I'd like to take this opportunity to express again my stalwart defense of anyone who uses Buthian pronunciation. Indeed, like I mentioned, it was Dr. Booth's studies that inspired this Lucian pronunciation project that I've been working on for years. Buthian pronunciation is highly pleasing to my ear, and I bet it is to a lot of you out there, and it resolves all the sound changes of the Koine period into their ultimate form, including the loss of vowel length and geminated consonants, a stage that the Greek language achieved immediately prior to the medieval period. And while something like Buthian pronunciation may have existed earlier than the 4th century AD, it just wouldn't be proper to call it the pronunciation of Koine, just as it wouldn't be proper to call the 21st century General American pronunciation the pronunciation of all modern English, from the 15th century to the present, from Shakespeare to J.K. Rowling. General American is most definitely a pronunciation variant of modern English, but it cannot possibly represent all the variety of the language in this century, much less the last 6. But I repeat, Buthian pronunciation is an absolutely beautiful convention. I think it's really pleasant to listen to, much like modern Greek, and it's certainly no worse than the cacophony of Erasmian conventions that I derided earlier. There's no doubt in my mind that Buthian pronunciation is superior to every last one of those. I just find its critical limitation is that it robs the user of the ability to appreciate the poetry and also the prose where metrical considerations abound, which is frequent in most of the prose authors. And one could make an excellent argument, as Randall Booth has, that epigraphical evidence in the form of spelling errors shows that Greek speakers were losing phonemic vowel length and that the nature of the accent was changing from one of pitch to one of stress, at least some place and some time in Koine history. Could have been earlier, could have been later. But this was a continuous process, as aptly demonstrated by J.N. Adams in Social Variation in the Latin Language, where phonemic vowel length is only lost in certain environments at first, such as in final syllables. And this is actually confirmed for Greek by Ben Cantor and other scholars. So the gradual loss of vowel length then spreads to other syllables, but it's only some parts of the word to start with. The evidence available suggests that, depending on the region, this process, the loss of phonemic vowel length and also the shift of accent, that took several centuries to complete. So the practical value of retaining phonemic vowel length and syllable length is extremely high. Clearly to the literature, absolutely, obviously to the poetry, even Koine era poetry, and also Koine era songs. In fact, some of the most amazing knowledge we have about pitch accent is from the Koine period, because the sheet music shows that the melody actually is influenced by the pitch accent of the words. It's incredible. As late as the 2nd century AD. So I suppose what I've been doing for the past several minutes is putting on one side the more conservative traits of retained phonemic vowel length and pitch accent, and on the other side, the disregarding of phonemic vowel length and syllable quantity, and just stress accent instead of pitch accent. And whether we use one or the other is a personal choice that we have to make in our modern era. And we make that based on the evidence, indeed, from the Koine period. Were speakers of ancient Greek actually using pitch accent and phonemic vowel length, or were they not? And if there were groups of both, how did they interact and how did they regard one another? Daniela Colombo, in a 2017 paper, examined the usage of quantity marks like macrons to indicate phonemic vowel length in the rather informal writings of Koine-era Greek speakers. And she makes a really interesting observation. Several literary sources of the Roman period show awareness by scholars and intellectuals of the fact that the Koine pronunciation deviated to a considerable extent from the allegedly classical Attic pronunciation, that is, from what was considered to be the flawless pronunciation which educated people, the so-called pepaideomenoi of the Greek-speaking world, should aim at. In reality, such a pronunciation, meaning the ideal pronunciation of the Greek language in the Koine period, was the pronunciation of Attic in the 2nd century AD. Philostratos, who himself was born in Lemnos but educated in Athens, expresses the view that it is necessary to visit Athens to pick up the correct Attic pronunciation. On the more specific issue of the loss of distinction of vowel quantity in the Koine pronunciation, Philostratos complains about the accent and the pronunciation of a rhetorician, Pausanias of Caesarea, saying that he pronounces the short vowels as long and the long ones as short. I'll use the Romaic Lucian pronunciation because it may still have been the current pronunciation in Athens, or something akin to it. Pakea te glote kai hos kapodokais xunetes, xunkruon menta xumpo naton stoikeon, xustelon de ta me cunomena, kai me cuon ta brachea. So according to Philostratus, this Pausanias of Caesarea would give his orations with gross speech and, as usual for the Cappadocians, colliding together the consonants on the one hand, and on the other, shortening the long vowels while lengthening the short ones. This means two things. On the one hand, it means that he was not using phonemic vowel length, that this Pausanias of Caesarea wasn't using phonemic vowel length, something that has been observed by Booth and others in the epigraphic evidence, and that also he wasn't observing geminated consonants or the phonemic syllable length that is derived from putting more than one consonant together, the colliding together of the consonants. Coloma continues, but in the case of Apollonius of Tyana, who comes from the same region as Pausanias, Cappadocia, he praises the absence of a regional accent and the perfect Attic pronunciation. I find this really interesting as it has parallels in modern languages. To name one example I happen to be familiar with, Standard Italian phonology is not native to most Italians, and all Italians who wish to make a career in film, politics, theater, broadcasting, or public speaking of any kind must study Standard Italian diction to neutralize their regional accents as much as possible. Similarly, while most Italians don't pronounce Italian with Standard Italian phonology, you'll be hard-pressed to find any course that teaches the Italian language and also encourages students not to learn the standard pronunciation of the language. Thus, deep into the Koine period, almost late Koine, from as late as the 3rd century AD, we have just heard the words of Philostratus admonish us to learn the accent of Athens, which even at that late date was likely similar to the Romaic Lucian pronunciation. Or, if not, the bare minimum we must do is what native Greek speakers were expected to do when they became orators and educators: observe phonemic vowel length and geminated consonants. On the other hand, Philostratus's comments also establish the validity, in a linguistically descriptive way, of disregarding vowel and syllable length, thus allowing us to conclude that something like Buthian and Lucian pronunciation evidently coexisted, certainly if we take all the evidence into account, including the opinion of Philostratus. That's why I support anyone who prefers Buthian pronunciation. It certainly existed, and indeed coexisted with the more conservative phonologies and the conventions I recommend. So when working with Koine Greek texts, whose authors may have had phonemic vowel length just as neatly as they had in Classical Attic, or may have lost it entirely, or, I think more likely than that scenario, they lost phonemic vowel length only in certain environments within the word, is it a better pedagogical decision to teach students to recite with phonemic vowel length so that they internalize it as natural to them, and thus they can appreciate all of ancient Greek literature, while informing the students that many of the authors may have had an imperfect production of vowel length when they were alive, and that this can occasionally be revealed in spelling errors in the papyri? Or is it better never to teach phonemic vowel length at all, so that the students think of the poetic meter, this what I think as a foundation of ancient Greek literature, as an alien and artificial construct? Given what you know about my feelings towards the power and beauty of ancient Greek poetry, you know where my opinion falls on this one. But ultimately, this is a personal choice. And I believe reasonable people, even listening to this whole long video of mine, could then still choose Buthian pronunciation because it is still a little bit easier. It's a perfectly reasonable choice, and I support anyone who makes it. I don't see this at all as a matter of competition. I see this as a bunch of scholars and students of ancient Greek who just want to explore the language in the way that they feel is best for them. And my intent with this rather lengthy discourse has been to provide you, the viewer, with an array of choices, since you may once have felt like I did, that classical Attic pronunciation and Buthian pronunciation, lovely as they are, they're just too far apart from one another, and they both present certain obstacles, and that a third choice in the middle was needed. So, which should you choose? Romaic Lucian is rather akin to classical Attic. That's interesting. It's also a good model for late Hellenistic and early Roman Koine, whether you're thinking of the spoken Greek in Italy, Attica, or Judea. But the aspirates are an obstacle for most. But thankfully, Pompeian Lucian takes care of that problem and provides a landing pad of sorts for those who hitherto have used Erasmian and want to try something a bit more historical. Alexandrine and Memphite Lucian have a good deal of evidence to back up their phonologies, but are also among the most difficult to put into practice, again because of those aspirates. Nevertheless, for enthusiasts passionate about exploring the Egyptian world, this might be a good starting place. It's worth pointing out that Memphite is pretty close to Antiochene. It has monophthongs a and u, but because a and u only occur for those writings, that means that they're still distinct in the phonology. They're not merged with e and u, which is potentially helpful. Samosatene and Antiochene Lucian pronunciation are filled with those fun innovations that we talked about. Antiochene has all the familiar qualities of Buthian pronunciation, but keeps those essential quantities, those characteristics common to all variants of Lucian pronunciation, phonemic vowel length and pitch accent. So this might be a useful convention for those who want to modify their Buthian pronunciation slightly to be able to appreciate the entire corpus of ancient Greek literature, and not just late Koine prose, as valuable and fascinating as that period is. And Samosatene Lucian is for those who aren't quite ready to accept all the monophthongs of Antiochene, since that does create quite a large semantic load. It does create kind of a burden trying to understand things with all of those mergers. And they also enjoy the transitional nature of the various phonemes. And they also might hope that their speech could be understood by a wide variety of people. I decided to limit the variants to just 6. 3 pairs, each with a more conservative and more innovative take, and to incorporate into these variants most of the possible combinations that might be fit as usable conventions. But these 6 variants of Lucian pronunciation are by no means the only possible realizations. You might take one of these variants as your starting point, but then make any number of alterations for your own personal convention, and I'll show you how. For example, Antiochene Lucian has bilabial dental fricative f-v, as in modern Greek. And this is how many users of Buthian pronunciation realize the sounds, but some, like Ben Cantor, advocate the bilabial fricatives f-v, which I have prescribed in the Samosatene Lucian variant. But there's no reason you couldn't have them in the Antiochene variant as well. It's also possible to use the bilabial f in Pompeian. I prescribed f for Pompeian, like the contemporaneous Latin sound, however, because the interchange las fe for las the suggests the involvement of the teeth, so labiodental seemed more likely to me. And also the f sound is easier to produce for most people, and it also occurs in many modern European languages, and of course in Latin. Although in the classical period, some Latin speakers probably did have a bilabial fricative, but that's another video. Earlier, I had some chastising remarks for those who mistakenly render affricates when they mean to produce aspirated stops in their classical Attic pronunciation. However, affricates were definitely part of the transformation of aspirated stops into fricatives, and thus are entirely legitimate as a variation you might do in any of the Lucian pronunciation variants. Reflecting again on the quote by Sextus Empiricus, he meant one of 2 things. Either that some people say phi theta chi as semi-vowels, or that some people consider that they should be classed as semi-vowels. The earlier interpretation I gave was that Sextus Empiricus was saying that some people pronounce phi theta chi as ph theta ch, and others pronounce them as the more conservative pronunciation k ta p. But what Sextus Empiricus could be saying is that phi, theta, and chi of his day only have one sound each that anybody uses for them as far as he knows. And in this hypothetical second interpretation, those sounds were affricates. And if that's so, any grammarian could reasonably classify them either as stops or as the semivowels, as fricatives. So that's very interesting. The only shame is that affricates are really tricky to master. They're at least as hard as getting the aspirates right, like we discussed earlier. We don't want to say akaris, we want to make sure that's akaris. It's not okay to lengthen that preceding syllable. So if you want to experiment with affricates, make sure that you're saying akaris, pirosopos, dithemi. Now, I think they sound super cool if you get them right, and Raphael Torrigiano actually wanted to prescribe affricates instead of fricatives for the original Lucian pronunciation in 2020, and I only managed to talk him out of it because they're just so difficult to pronounce for most people, but doesn't mean you can't give it a shot. In each of the 6 variants, either all 3 voiceless aspirated stops are fricatives, or all 3 voiced stops are fricatives, or all 6 are, or none of them are. The evidence available to us shows that these sounds may have developed one by one, not necessarily all at once in groups, depending on the century and geography. In Egypt, gamma probably changed first, starting in the 2nd century BC, followed by beta in the 1st century AD, and then delta in the 2nd century AD. Although it is possible that they perhaps developed earlier, altogether around the same time. See Gignac for that. In Italy, at Pompeii, we have ample evidence for phi as a fricative, and one example for theta, but none for chi. So, it's possible some speakers had only 1 or 2 fricatives for former aspirates. And some of these might have been affricates too, so there are lots of possibilities to play with. The conventions of Lucian pronunciation have these more convenient groups because they are indeed conventions. They're certainly reasonable as reconstructions, but like I said, a lot of possibilities exist. And speaking of aspiration, the rough breathing wasn't silent in Classical Attic, but it was silent in dialects of Ionic and Aeolic contemporary with Classical Attic. And in any case, the H sound could have become silent for any speaker of ancient Greek at virtually any stage in the change of Koine. Heck, this even happens with some English speakers today. So while some variants have a pronounced rough breathing and others do not, there's really no reason you can't play with doing one or the other in your personal convention. Whatever you do, make sure you don't merge the rough breathing, the h sound, with the ch sound, or even the sh sound, that palatal fricative sound. Don't merge hu and shu, or he and she. Those are different. A lot of English speakers actually have that merged. I don't normally. I say he, but a lot of English speakers say she. That would be the chi, not the rough breathing equivalent. So be careful of that. There's another variation that I like to call the Hesperian option. Hesperia, that's the ancient name for Spain. It would be to treat voiced stops, the gamma, delta, and beta, like G, B, and D in Spanish, where they're all stops initially and after nasals, but approximates intervocalically. What would that sound like? Bye-bye. Geronos. Didomi. I'm really fond of this characteristic of Spanish, and it's also a perfectly reasonable reconstruction of Koine pronunciation in a stage of transition. And I've wanted to prescribe it in a Lucian pronunciation variant, but I decided not to because I just didn't want to introduce more complexity. So I'll leave this Hesperian option to the Hispanophones to play with as they develop their own personal conventions. We saw earlier the path of change of alpha hupsilon, au, au, auv, av, av, and of epsilon hupsilon, eu, euv, ev, ev. Au and eu are false diphthongs since they terminate in a consonant instead of an off-glide vowel. It's really just a technicality, but it does create a slight difference acoustically. And there's no reason these couldn't occur in a lot of the variants that we looked at today, even potentially in Classical Attic. The phonetic difference is slight, but these are fun to play with if this is your thing. In Romaic and Pompeian Lucian, the diphthongs alpha iota and omicron iota are identified with their Classical Latin counterparts, a, e, and oe, and are prescribed with the same pronunciation, I, oi. This is a reasonable reconstruction since the Roman sources don't indicate anything other than the exact same pronunciation, and the development of the broad Classical Attic era diphthongs, I, oi, into monophthongs necessitates that they pass through a narrow diphthong stage, much as Latin did between Old Latin and Late Latin. Hence the Romans changing the spelling from ai and oi to ae and oe for Classical Latin. However, a number of possible transitional diphthongs are possible, as we saw from the chain of mutations earlier. Greek, as heard by the Romans, could have had the broad diphthong still, ai, oi, or the very narrow diphthongs prescribed in the Samosatene variant, ai, ui, and such variants may be applied to virtually any of the conventions discussed. Much earlier, we discussed how the long diphthongs, I, ai, oi, had left the language between 150 and 50 BC. But if you wish to affect an accent for earlier Hellenistic Greek, well, all you need to do is take the Romaic variant and restore the long diphthongs. That'll take you all the way back to essentially the end of Classical Attic. In Theodorson's 1978 work, he mentions that while Hellenistic omicron and omega have frequent interchanges in the misspellings, which suggests a quality merger for these two, neither tends to interchange with the long diphthong omega with iota subscript, even when that iota is omitted in the writing. Now, what could cause that? That's very interesting. Theodorson's conclusion is that omega with iota subscript was a long open aw, while the regular omega was a true mid or a closed mid o, and it had merged in quality with the omicron. So feel free to add this into your own personal convention. While Antiochene Lucian is quite like Buthian, it doesn't include a key feature of Buthian and also of modern Greek, and that's the lenition of kappa, tau, and pi when preceded by a nasal. However, you could certainly add this into Antiochene Lucian if you want, or possibly to any of the 6 conventions. Thus, instead of angura, anti, ampelos, you would pronounce these as angura, andi, ambelos. Palatalization, as in modern Greek, is prescribed in Alexandrine, Memphite, Samosatene, and Antiochene because it's necessary to permit the ye pronunciation in words like genesis. But palatalization could have occurred quite early in the history of the Greek language, whether or not there's the fricative of gamma to permit that lovely ye sound in genesis. So you could have ge and ke quite early in the Greek language. We just don't know. So if you want to add that in earlier, it is a reasonable reconstruction. I think it's a Koine thing, but who knows how early it came in. It could definitely give your Romaic or Pompeian Lucian variants an interesting flair. The voiceless rho, when initial or geminated, is prescribed for all the variants except for Memphite and Antiochene. But it's reasonable to have voiceless rho or not, depending on what type of reconstruction you're going for. The data seem to confirm that voiceless rho was the norm in Koine, but eventually it does leave the Greek language, so you can play with this option. Given the huge corpus of attested spelling errors in Egypt for which see Gignac, a number of conventions could be assembled for the sound of Greek from Hellenistic through Roman times just in that region. The vowels and diphthongs could have been more like in Samosatene and Antiochene, perhaps more like Romaic and Pompeian, or even something else entirely. Like I said, see Gignac for all the details there. So you could tweak your Alexandrine and Memphite base conventions in such a way to affect a different Egyptian Greek reconstruction. You could also play around with the loss of vowel length and gemination in your personal conventions. Now, those are really fundamental to Lucian pronunciation in these prescribed conventions that I've talked about today. But the Lucian Pronunciation System is a set of conventions for beginning to explore all manner of historical phonologies in the Koine period. So even this departure from the core prescription of Lucian pronunciation is naturally acceptable while you're exploring these things, while attempting to identify the sound of a specific author or region or time period. This is something that also you can definitely experiment with if you're interested. Another departure from Lucian pronunciation regards iota in hiatus, meaning when it forms a syllable before another vowel. For example, the afero in Antiochene Lucian, the iota forms a separate syllable, the. There is, however, evidence from some sources in the Koine period that the iota in this position was becoming a semivowel, and thus the first 2 vowels merge into an on-glide diphthong, diafero, even diafero. Since this alters the number of syllables, and syllable length and number is strictly preserved in all the variants, employing this innovation would not be part of the Lucian pronunciation system, but it definitely has historical validity, and you could use it as you construct your own convention for Koine. If you feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of possibilities, then we're in the same boat. The 6 variants I prescribed probably cover some of the vast majority of the needs that the audience of this video might have. And a brave few will attempt to tweak the conventions presented here in one of the alternative ways just mentioned. No doubt there will be those in the comments who, in light of all the evidence and unable to process it, throw up their hands and insist that reconstructing the ancient pronunciation is impossible without a tape recorder, and one shouldn't bother and just use whatever convention they prefer, like modern Greek pronunciation. To them I say, you can't even reconstruct the modern Greek pronunciation of modern Greek, even with tape recorders. That is to say, there are lots of accents and dialects in the modern Greek language, and the paradoxical data make it impossible to reconstruct just one phonology for the speech of all native speakers. That's exactly what we're presented with for any modern language, and most definitely for ancient languages too. The prescribed pronunciation of Standard Italian, Standard Modern Greek, Standard French, these are all just conventions. Anyone who decries, "We cannot know the sound of ancient Greek because they had no tape recorders," must therefore also declare, "We cannot know that the 300 Spartans defended Thermopylae because there's no video record of the event, and we cannot know what Caesar or Cicero looks like because we don't have any photographs from antiquity." Archaeology, philology, and history allow us to know many things in great detail, including the sound of ancient languages. The present video has been an exploration of linguistic archaeology, and using this information, we've turned it into a sort of historical reenactment, like fashioning and wearing the armor of an ancient legionary in the authentic manner. Both of these, archaeology and reenactment, are worthy studies and endeavors. But as students of language, these activities have yet another practical utility. Using an historical pronunciation convention permits us a deeper understanding of the literature, and that's what it's all about. Can you do Romeo and Juliet in 20th century English pronunciation in modern Los Angeles? Absolutely. Does such a performance have value? Sure. Does it reveal as much about the original literature and its historical context as an authentic to the 16th century performance in the Globe Theatre with actors all using original Shakespearean pronunciation? Not even close. Much earlier, I briefly touched on the fact that I render Lucian pronunciation's pitch accent as indeed a pitch accent, but supported by dynamic stress, that is, with a volume change, with a louder volume. And I do this primarily because, well, it's actually historically valid as an option. Now, there's no doubt that pitch accent was a fundamental part of Koine Greek, as the ancient Greeks and the Romans attest to the musical pitch nature of the Greek accent in the accounts of the grammarians. There's also derisive comments about the sing-songy way that Greeks speak Latin. And also, there are sheet music compositions that have survived to this day, and in them we see that the melody actually is influenced by the natural pitch accent of these words. That's incredible. That means pitch accent is probably super important late into the Koine period. So pitch accent is absolutely a thing in Koine Greek. However, including a secondary stress component to the pitch accent is also a good historical reconstruction, as it explains how the Romans were able to describe their own stress accent through comparison with Greek words, with Greek pitch accent. And moreover, the pitch accent in Greek did eventually become one of stress, as in modern Greek. Actually, depending on the sentence, a good amount of modern Greek speech, especially simple statements, actually retains a bit of pitch accent as a secondary component to the lexical stress accent. But in any case, before it became stress accent, the pitch accent must also have had a stress component before it disregarded the pitch variation as the lexical phonemic thing. However, the practical reason to allow dynamic volume, that is stress accent, to accompany pitch accent in Lucian pronunciation is that it helps those unfamiliar with true pitch accent languages like Japanese to acclimate to the system. It helps a lot with comprehension if I say legontai, where the le is louder, at least, and the rest of the word is quieter. Whereas if it's just pitch accent and there's no stress, there's no dynamic volume change, kind of like Japanese, you would hear legontai, and that might be just that much more confusing. So I don't mind stress accent accompanying pitch accent to make it clearer. When it comes to the 6 variants of Lucian pronunciation, you might wonder which of these was the more classy, proper form of Koine speech, and which was the voice of the common people. As interesting and as sociolinguistically important as this question is, I want to sound a heavy note of caution on attempting to assign class registers to any reconstruction of Koine pronunciation, because this is a really dubious idea. It's tempting, I know, to say that a more conservative variant like Romaic Lucian would be limited to the speech of the elites, and that a more innovative variant like Antiochene Lucian was what regular people sounded like. But studies of modern languages throw a lot of cold water on that idea. Non-standard varieties of languages, from French to Italian to English, they can often have more conservative traits in the place that's far away from the capital or from the center of culture than that very center, which is very interesting. It's not intuitive. And yet this occurs in France. British RP, that is actually way more innovative than a variety of accents and dialects in the English countryside nearby. Italian dialects often show a number of conservative traits with respect to standard Italian. Naturally, there's plenty of innovation we can find in the speech of the common people of any language, but the assumption that innovations are exclusively the province of the lower classes is potentially fraught with issues. So if you're especially interested in how the first Christians spoke Greek, don't be too concerned with using the most innovative pronunciation, since those Christians could easily have come from rural environments where they still used aspirates and had all their diphthongs still. Or if you prefer the most high-class speech you can imagine, don't shy away from innovation, as it's just as likely to have existed in the voices of politicians and poets. Speech that's considered high-class or low-class, taboo or standard, is dependent on so many factors. Whether a certain speech characteristic is more innovative or conservative doesn't necessarily guide us here. As for the nicknames of each of the 6 variants, I want to reiterate that while there is a geographical component to the phonology of the convention, none of these reconstructions is necessarily limited by geography. Romaic Lucian, for example, which most definitely could have been heard in 1st century Rome, but it was also probably heard in Athens and Judea as well. Alexandria and Memphis lend their names to the 2 Egyptian variants simply because they're famous cities. There could be all kinds of geographical and dialectical variation in Egypt, and I'd love to see more studies on that. Their nicknames are just meant to remind us of the general source of the evidence, and it's conceivable that other places outside of Egypt had a similar phonology. Antioch and Samosata, similarly, are cities representing numerous pronunciation changes that were attested earlier in the region of Anatolia, but it's possible they were spoken elsewhere too. And Pompeian might have been the result of a mix of certain classical Greek dialects like Doric with the Koine as it spread, and thus may have been spoken not just elsewhere in Italy, but even back in Greece. And while any given variety of Greek certainly had a local accent, we need only recall the constant movement of people from teachers to merchants to politicians to poets all across the Mediterranean during the Roman period, meaning that all manner of pronunciations were likely spoken side by side in the busy agoras of the polities around the rim of their sea. So the nicknames are just that, nicknames to help us remember the conventions. Some people have asked whether Lucian pronunciation is named after me. It's not. It's named after Lucian of Samosata, and Raphael Torrigiano and I chose Lucian because he was a Koine Greek period author who wrote in good classical Attic style, part of a literary movement called the Second Sophistic, a sort of renaissance of classical literature. This union of forms of ancient Greek literature was symbolically exactly what we were going for, a pronunciation convention that could be used for working with the literature of all ancient Greek. That said, after this question was first posed to me, I noticed, oh yeah, in ancient Greek, I call myself Lukios, and my Latin name is Lucius, so Lucian would be, of course, in the same vein as Buthian, Erasmian, and Roic-Linian. That wasn't the intent, but if you find that a helpful mnemonic, much like the nicknames of the 6 variants, that's fine by me. In training myself to recite in the 6 variants of Lucian pronunciation, I've noticed that my ability to listen to all kinds of spoken ancient Greek has broadened immensely. Whether I listen to a speaker of classical Attic pronunciation, or of Buthian, or Roic-Linian, or even some of the, let's call them, worst kinds of Erasmian pronunciation that I've often found so confusing, the consequence of my habituating to the 6 Lucian variants is that I find it much easier to understand and appreciate the content of whatever the person is actually saying. And I'm considerably less distracted by the inconsistencies in their speech, or in anything else I might find unusual or unfamiliar. So this has been a very positive and unexpected result. If you listen to recordings of mine in multiple Lucian pronunciation variants, let me know if you have a similar experience. I've received reports like that so far, but go ahead and let me know if you feel that too. And I'm actually quite interested in your feedback on this topic, especially if you try to experiment with one or more of the variants. I really want to hear from you, so feel free to leave a post below, even months or years from now after experimenting with different pronunciation variants on your own. In the end, I'm just a student of ancient languages as much as I'm a teacher, and I enjoy exploring them in a myriad of ways, and I just wanted to share a bit of my passion with all of you. Something else I'd like to share with you is my audiobook, Lucian's Judgment of the Goddesses, where each of the 6 characters speaks in a different Lucian pronunciation. It includes an English translation, so even if you're new to ancient Greek, you can get a lot out of it. To summarize this lengthy video essay, thanks for sticking with me till the end, I really appreciate it. Lucian pronunciation is a phonological system that represents the changing sound of Greek during the Koine period, and codifies these fascinating transformations into conventions that anyone can use. Whether to perform when reconstructing the voice of an ancient author, as one's personal pronunciation when reading aloud, or to teach with in the classroom. With 6 variants to choose from, there's a great deal of flexibility built into the system, providing a diverse set of options that, in my opinion, can help bring the past to life in new and exciting ways. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks again to the Ancient Language Institute, and especially thank you to each and every one of my Patreon supporters. So as interesting as that might be, is there any utility beyond the gee whiz part of it? Thanks so much for watching. Thanks. Lucian pronunciation can help us learn and teach ancient Greek better. And I need to do the whole thing again. And especially thanks to each. What did Greek sound like 2,000 years ago here in Rome? In this video, named after 2nd century Greek author Lucian of Samosata, whose written word united classical Greek and this 2nd century AD, about Lucian pronunciation, named after 2nd century Greek author